Before there were forests, before there were mountains carved by wind and time, before the first footstep ever pressed into soft earth, there was the sea, ancient, vast, and almost perfectly silent, a world without sound as we know it, a world without color in the way we see it, a world that to human eyes would have looked utterly alien, and yet beneath that dark and shimmering surface something extraordinary was already happening. Life was stirring, life was changing. And the ocean was about to become the most dramatic stage that this planet has ever known. What you are about to witness is a story that spans hundreds of millions of years. It is a story of creatures so strange, so unlike anything walking the earth today, that when scientists first discovered their fossils, they genuinely could not agree on which end was the front and which was the back. It is a story of arms that grasped and eyes that saw in ways that had never existed before. Of shells grown like armor, of spines built for war, of bodies designed by pressure and time and the relentless necessity of survival. It is a story of entire worlds, rich, complex, teeming with life, that were swept away in geological moments, gone so completely that only stone and patient science remain to tell us they ever existed at all. This is the story of the Paleozoic Sea, and it begins not with a roar but with a whisper. Close your eyes for just a moment and imagine an ocean. Not the ocean as it looks today, with its dolphins arching through spray, its whales singing in the deep, its coral reefs blazing with color. Imagine instead an ocean almost entirely without any of those things, an ocean so old that the continents above it do not yet resemble anything on a map you would recognize. An ocean that stretches across a world where the atmosphere is different, where the chemistry of the water is different, where the light that falls from a younger sun strikes a surface that has never once reflected a bird's shadow. This is the ocean that existed before the Paleozoic era, the Precambrian world, and it was not empty, not entirely. Life had already been present on this planet for billions of years by this point, but the life that existed was largely invisible, microbial, bacterial. Single-celled organisms drifting through the water column in mats and films and colonies, so small that a handful of seawater contained multitudes beyond counting. These organisms were remarkable in their own right. They had, after all, transformed this planet. The early Earth had almost no free oxygen in its atmosphere. The sky was a haze of methane and carbon dioxide. The ocean itself was a chemical soup far removed from what swims in it today. And then quietly, over the course of billions of years, these microscopic pioneers changed everything. Cyanobacteria, ancient photosynthesizers, began to pull carbon dioxide from the water and release oxygen as a byproduct. They did this not once or twice, but continuously, generation after generation, for so long that the oceans gradually oxygenated, and then the atmosphere above them began to change as well. This was not a comfortable transition. For many of the organisms that had thrived in the low oxygen, high carbon world, the rising tide of oxygen was essentially poison. This event, which geologists call the Great Oxidation Event, happened roughly 2.5 billion years ago, and in its own way it was the first great extinction, a transformation so profound that it reorganized life on Earth at the most fundamental level. But from that transformation came possibility. Oxygen-rich environments allowed for new kinds of chemistry, new kinds of cellular metabolism, and eventually, new kinds of life. For billions of years, though, that life remained essentially simple. The dominion of the single cell was absolute. There were no eyes to see, no limbs to move, no mouths to eat with, just chemistry and time and the slow accumulation of genetic information that would, eventually, make everything else possible. And then in the late Precambrian, roughly 600 million years ago, something began to shift. The creatures of the Ediacaran period are among the most mysterious beings that ever lived on this planet. They appear in the fossil record like a question written in stone, soft-bodied, frequently frond-shaped, sometimes round and quilted like an air mattress, sometimes elongated and feathery, attached to the seafloor or drifting through the water above it. Paleontologists have been debating their nature for decades, and that debate continues even now. Were they animals? Were they some kind of organism that had no relationship to any modern group at all, something so fundamentally different in its biology that we lack even the vocabulary to categorize it properly. Were they perhaps more like living mats of tissue, feeding through osmosis and diffusion, absorbing nutrients directly from the water and sediment around them? The honest answer is that we do not fully know. What we do know is that these Ediacaran organisms represented something genuinely new. They were large by the standards of their day at least, with some reaching lengths of a meter or more, and they were complex, at least structurally. They had organized bodies, repeated patterns, internal structures that suggested some kind of coordinated growth. One of the most famous of these organisms is Dickinsonia, a flattened oval creature with a series of bands or segments running across its body. For years, scientists argued about what it was. Fossil evidence suggests it was capable of some form of movement, leaving impressions in ancient sediment as it moved. More recently, chemical analysis of exceptionally preserved Dickinsonia fossils has revealed the presence of cholesterol compounds, molecules that are closely associated with animal cell membranes. This suggests that Dickinsonia was, in fact, an animal of some kind, but it was an animal unlike any alive today. It had no eyes, no mouth, no distinct front or back as far as we can tell. It was something that evolution tried, explored, and then apparently set aside. Another Ediacaran icon is Charnia, a frond-shaped creature attached to the seafloor, elegant and leaf-like in its form. And then there is Kimberella, which is particularly fascinating because it shows evidence of a muscular foot and what may have been a feeding structure of some kind, possibly scratching at microbial mats on the seafloor and ingesting the material it disturbed. If Kimberella was indeed doing something like this, then it was engaging in active feeding, which would make it one of the earliest known animals to do so. The Ediacaran world was strange and slow and soft. It was a world without hard parts, no shells, no teeth, no bones, and there was something almost dream-like about it. A seafloor carpeted in microbial mats, gently swaying fronds reaching upward into the water, flattened quilted bodies easing slowly across the sediment in the dim light filtering down from above. It was peaceful in a way that the ocean would not be peaceful again for a very long time, because something was coming. Something that would shatter this quiet world so completely that paleontologists have never stopped arguing about what caused it or what it means. An event so dramatic that it left a mark in the fossil record visible to anyone who knows how to read stone. Something that happened right at the boundary between the Precambrian and the next great chapter of life on Earth, the Cambrian Explosion. The word explosion is doing a lot of work here, and it is worth pausing for a moment to clarify what scientists mean when they use it. They do not mean that life literally exploded in an instant. The timescales involved are still geological, measured in millions of years, not days or centuries. What the Cambrian explosion refers to is the rapid, in geological terms, appearance in the fossil record of nearly all the major body plans of animals that have ever existed. The phyla, the fundamental structural blueprints. Before the Cambrian, the fossil record of complex animal life is sparse and strange. After the beginning of the Cambrian, roughly 540 million years ago, it is suddenly rich with a bewildering diversity of creatures possessing eyes, limbs, shells, gills, nervous systems, and behaviors that represent an almost incomprehensible leap in biological complexity. The question of why this happened, what triggered this explosion of diversity, remains one of the most contested questions in all of paleontology. Various explanations have been proposed over the decades. Some researchers have pointed to the rising oxygen levels in the ocean, arguing that sufficient oxygen concentrations were necessary for the metabolic demands of larger, more active animals, and that once those oxygen levels crossed a critical threshold, the biological potential for complex life was finally unlocked. Others have focused on environmental changes, including shifts in ocean chemistry that made it easier for organisms to build shells and hard body parts, a crucial development that we will return to in just a moment. Some researchers have looked at the Cambrian explosion from an ecological angle, arguing that it was in part driven by a kind of evolutionary arms race. Once some organisms began to develop predatory behaviors, the ability to hunt and actively consume other organisms rather than simply absorbing nutrients passively, the pressure on everything else in the ecosystem increased dramatically. Prey species that developed protective armor or better sensory abilities survived longer and reproduced more. Predators that developed better hunting tools caught more prey and were better nourished. And this escalating cycle of adaptation drove diversification at a pace unlike anything that had come before. There may also be a developmental genetics component to the story. The evolution of certain key regulatory genes that control the basic architecture of the body during development, may have opened up new possibilities for body organization that simply did not exist before. These so-called Hox genes, which help determine where different body structures develop along an animal's axis, are deeply conserved across almost all animal life. Their early evolution may have been part of what made the Cambrian diversification possible in the first place. The truth is almost certainly a combination of many factors, interacting with each other in ways that are still being untangled. But whatever the cause, the result was spectacular. And it left behind one of the most extraordinary fossil deposits in the history of paleontology. The Burgess Shale sits high in the Canadian Rockies, in a place that was 508 million years ago at the bottom of a shallow tropical sea near the edge of an underwater cliff. The creatures that lived near this cliff were occasionally overwhelmed by submarine mudslides, sudden avalanches of fine sediment that buried them rapidly and completely, cutting them off from oxygen and decay. The result was fossilization so exceptional that even the soft tissues of these animals were preserved. Their guts, their gills, the outlines of their muscles, even the contents of their last meals. When Charles Doolittle Walcott discovered this deposit in 1909, he recognized immediately that he had found something extraordinary. Over the following years, he collected tens of thousands of specimens, and his initial interpretations attempted to fit these strange creatures into the familiar categories of modern animal groups. For decades, that interpretation largely held. The Burgess Shale was thought to be an ancestral version of the modern marine world, a slightly weirder but recognizable precursor to the ocean we know today. And then in the 1970s and 1980s, a new round of analysis, led by researchers including Harry Whittington and his students Simon Conway Morris and Derek Briggs, began to overturn this comfortable picture. Looking more carefully at the fossils, they found animals that did not fit neatly into any modern category. Animals so structurally bizarre that they seemed to belong to body plans that had no living descendants whatsoever. Extinct experiments. Evolutionary paths tried and abandoned. The ocean of the Cambrian, it began to seem, had been populated not just with the ancestors of today's creatures, but with entire lineages that had lived their full span and then vanished completely from the earth. Among the most celebrated of these enigmatic creatures is Hallucigenia, a small animal named with full scientific irony, because when the fossil was first described, nobody could work out how it was supposed to function. It appeared to have stiff spines on one side and soft tentacles on the other, and the original interpretation placed it walking on its spines, which looked like stilts with the tentacles waving above it. It was only decades later, when better preserved specimens and new analytical techniques revealed the true orientation, that it became clear the spines were actually on the animal's back, serving as protection, while the creature walked on the soft tentacles, which were its legs. Even then, which end was the head remained genuinely uncertain for years. When the head was finally identified with confidence, it turned out to have a simple circular mouth and, delightfully, a secondary set of teeth inside its throat, presumably to help manipulate food once it was ingested. Hallucigenia has since been recognized as a relative of the velvet worms, soft-bodied, limbed animals that still exist today in the leaf litter of tropical forests, though their ocean-dwelling Cambrian cousins would be nearly unrecognizable to anyone who encountered the modern version. Then there is Opabinia, one of the most genuinely alien-looking animals that has ever existed on this planet. Opabinia had 5 eyes, 5, arranged across the front of its head. It had a flexible, nozzle-like proboscis extending from the front of its face, tipped with a grasping claw. Its body was segmented, with a series of lateral lobes that functioned as swimming fins. When Harry Whittington first presented his ray description of Opabinia to a scientific audience in the early 1970s, the crowd reportedly burst out laughing, not from any lack of seriousness, but simply because the creature was so profoundly, wonderfully strange. And yet Opabinia was real. It swam through a real ocean 500 million years ago, using those 5 eyes to navigate and that remarkable proboscis to reach into sediment or crevices and snatch prey. And then there is Wiwaxia, a slow-moving, slug-like creature covered in an armor of overlapping scales and bristling with upward-pointing spines. It probably grazed on the microbial mats that still carpeted the seafloor in the Cambrian, scraping its food up with a rasping feeding structure. The spines were almost certainly defensive, a deterrent to the predators that were now, for the first time in the history of life on Earth, actively hunting. This arms race between predator and prey is one of the most important storylines of the Cambrian, and it is written clearly in the fossil record. The appearance of hard shells, armor, and spines happens right at the beginning of the Cambrian, and it happens in multiple lineages simultaneously, suggesting that it was not a gradual, isolated development but a rapid, widespread response to a new kind of pressure. Something was eating things, and everything else was trying hard not to be eaten. The development of hard body parts, shells, mineralized skeletons, calcified armor, is one of the most consequential innovations in the history of life. It is what makes animals visible in the fossil record, which is part of why the Cambrian seems to erupt so suddenly with complexity. Before the Cambrian, most life was soft-bodied and left almost nothing behind in the stone. But the hard parts also changed ecology fundamentally. A shell is not just a fossil waiting to happen. It is protection, it is a weapon sometimes. It is a structure that can be used to anchor muscles, enabling new kinds of movement. It is, in a very real sense, a biological technology, and once it was invented, everything changed. The earliest mineralized creatures, sometimes called the small shelly fauna, appear in the fossil record just before and at the very beginning of the Cambrian. These were tiny organisms, often just a few millimeters in size, producing small, cone-shaped or tube-shaped shells whose biological relationships are still debated. Were they mollusks? Were they worms? Were they something else entirely? The diversity of these early shell builders is remarkable and often baffling, as if life was experimenting furiously with the new toolkit of biomineralization, trying out every possible configuration before settling on the designs that would prove most successful. Among the most successful of all Cambrian animals, and one of the most successful animal groups in the entire history of Earth, were the trilobites. These arthropods appeared near the beginning of the Cambrian and persisted for nearly 300 million years, eventually being wiped out in the same mass extinction that ended the Paleozoic era. In between, they diversified into thousands of species, occupied every kind of marine habitat, and developed an astonishing range of body forms. A trilobite is immediately recognizable once you know what you are looking at. The body is divided lengthwise into 3 lobes, the central axial lobe running down the middle, flanked by 2 pleural lobes on either side, which is where the name comes from. The body is also divided into 3 sections from front to back: the cephalon or head shield, the thorax, which consists of a series of articulated segments, and the pygidium, a fused tail section. The upper surface is covered in a calcified exoskeleton, which is what fossilizes so beautifully. The underside was soft, bearing the limbs, which were biramous, meaning each limb had 2 branches, one for walking and one that functioned as a gill. What is particularly remarkable about trilobites, and what speaks to the sophistication that life had already achieved by the early Cambrian, is their eyes. Many trilobites had compound eyes composed of individual lenses made of calcite crystalline calcium carbonate. These were not simple light-detecting patches. They were complex optical systems, capable of forming detailed images, detecting motion, and in some cases providing nearly 360 degrees of vision around the animal's head. Some trilobite eyes were among the most sophisticated ever to evolve, with unique optical properties that allowed them to function at different depths and light levels with minimal distortion. The variety of trilobite forms across the Paleozoic is breathtaking. There were tiny species just a few millimeters long and enormous ones stretching to nearly a meter. There were trilobites with elaborate spines projecting from every surface, some so extravagantly decorated that they look more like science fiction than natural history. There were species that could roll into a ball, like a pill bug, protecting their soft underside when threatened. There were planktonic species that floated in the open ocean and benthic species that burrowed into the sediment. There were predators and filter feeders and scavengers. For nearly 300 million years, trilobites were one of the most dominant and diverse groups of animals in the ocean. But even the trilobites, extraordinary as they were not the most fearsome thing in the Cambrian Sea. To understand the Cambrian Ocean at its most dramatic, you have to understand Anomalocaris. The name means abnormal shrimp, and it was given before anyone fully understood what the creature was. The first fossils discovered were isolated appendages, curved, segmented structures that researchers initially thought might be the bodies of headless shrimp. It was only later, when more complete specimens were assembled and interpreted, that the full animal became clear, and what became clear was something quite unlike a shrimp. Anomalocaris was the apex predator of the Cambrian Ocean. Depending on the species, it reached lengths of perhaps 60 centimeters to a meter or more, at a time when most other animals were measured in millimeters. It was built for speed and capture, a streamlined, bilaterally symmetrical body with a series of lateral lobes along each side that undulated in waves, propelling it through the water with surprising agility. At the front of its head, two large, flexible, segmented appendages reached forward, the grasping frontal appendages that had originally been misidentified as shrimp bodies. These could seize prey and draw it toward the animal's circular, plated mouth, which opened and closed like an iris and was ringed with hard, tooth-like plates. Anomalocaris had eyes, large, compound eyes mounted on stalks at the sides of its head. A remarkably preserved specimen discovered in Australia, studied using scanning electron microscopy, revealed that these eyes contained at least 16,000 individual optical units. For context, the compound eyes of a modern dragonfly, one of the most visually acute insects alive today, contain around 30,000. Anomalocaris was not far behind. In a world where most other creatures were only just developing the ability to sense light at all, Anomalocaris could see with extraordinary precision. It could detect the movement of prey in the water column, track it, orient toward it, pursue it. This was a fundamentally new kind of organism, an active pursuit predator with a sophisticated sensory system, flexible grasping appendages, and a body designed for speed. And its existence changed everything about how every other organism in the Cambrian Ocean had to live its life. Before Anomalocaris, the primary selective pressure on most organisms was probably related to feeding efficiency, finding food, absorbing nutrients, growing, and reproducing. After Anomalocaris, or rather once animals like Anomalocaris existed, every organism also faced the constant threat of being caught and consumed. The calcified shells, the defensive spines, the ability to burrow into sediment, the development of eyes to spot danger, all of these innovations were responses, in whole or in part, to the existence of predators like this. Anomalocaris was not alone in its ecological role, and it was not the only member of its broader group. The radiodontans, the group to which Anomalocaris belonged, included a diversity of large, predatory animals that occupied the apex of Cambrian food webs. Some, like Herdia, had elaborate head structures that may have helped them process different kinds of prey. Others, like Hallucigenia, had frontal appendages modified not for grasping but for filter feeding, long comb-like structures that they swept through the water to collect small plankton, in a functional echo of what modern baleen whales do. This tells us something important. The radiodontans were not a single ecological type, they were diverse. They had already begun to specialize into different niches: predator, filter feeder, perhaps others we have not yet found. What makes all of this so significant is the timeline. We are talking about the very beginning of complex animal life on Earth. We are talking about animals that existed within the first few tens of millions of years of the Cambrian period. And already within that brief, in geological terms, time, you have the full ecological architecture of a modern marine food web beginning to take shape. Producers and primary consumers, secondary consumers and apex predators, scavengers processing the dead, filter feeders exploiting the plankton. It is an ecosystem, and it is recognizable as such, even though the specific players look like nothing alive today. It is worth stepping back for a moment and thinking about what the Cambrian Ocean would have looked and felt like if you could somehow stand on its floor. The water is warm. The Cambrian world was a greenhouse world, with no polar ice caps and a global ocean somewhat warmer on average than today's. The sea is shallow in many places because the continental configurations are entirely different from anything modern. The major landmasses of the Cambrian, Gondwana, Laurentia, Baltica, are arranged in positions that bear no resemblance to today's map. Much of what is now dry land is submerged under shallow epicontinental seas, and it is in these warm, shallow waters that much of the richest life is concentrated. The seafloor would be covered in many places by a layer of microbial mat, a thick, gelatinous film of photosynthetic and chemosynthetic bacteria that covers the sediment like a carpet. This mat was extremely important ecologically. It stabilized the sediment, preventing it from being churned up by bioturbation. It provided food for grazers, and it may have played a role in the exceptional preservation of soft-bodied fossils by creating anoxic conditions in the sediment just below the surface that slowed decomposition. Above the seafloor, the water column would be layered with different communities of organisms. Near the surface, in the photic zone where sunlight penetrated, phytoplankton, early photosynthetic organisms, would be drifting, capturing sunlight and building the base of the food web. Zooplankton would be feeding on them. Larger swimmers would be feeding on the zooplankton. And at the bottom, the benthos, the community of organisms living on and in the seafloor, would be engaged in their own complex web of interactions, eating, being eaten, burrowing, building, and competing for space. Looking around at eye level, if you were small enough to have eye level in this world, you would see creatures that looked like nothing on Earth today. Trilobites scuttling across the sediment, their many legs moving in coordinated waves. Wiwaxia moving slowly over the microbial mat, scraping it up with its feeding apparatus. Hallucigenia picking its way on stubby legs, its spines raised against attack. Opabinia hovering just above the seafloor, its 5 eyes scanning, its proboscis reaching. And then you might look up and see in the water above the silhouette of an Anomalocaris, long and sinuous, its lateral lobes rippling as it circles, its stalked eyes scanning the seafloor below. And every other organism near you might suddenly be very, very still. The Cambrian Ocean was not peaceful. It was a world in the midst of an arms race where the rules of engagement were being written in real time, and it was only just the beginning. As the Cambrian gave way to the Ordovician period, roughly 485 million years ago, the transformation of the ocean continued. The Ordovician is sometimes called the Great Ordovician Biodiversification Event, a second major pulse of diversification that took the foundations laid in the Cambrian and built upon them in elaborate and spectacular ways. If the Cambrian explosion created the fundamental blueprints of animal life, the Ordovician Biodiversification Event furnished and decorated the house. By the Ordovician, the ocean was becoming recognizable in its broad ecological structure, even if none of its specific inhabitants would look familiar today. Reefs were developing, not coral reefs as we know them now, but structures built primarily by sponges and by colonial animals called stromatoporoids, as well as tabulate and rugose corals that bear only a superficial resemblance to their modern counterparts. These reef structures created complex three-dimensional habitats with many different microenvironments, increasing the available ecological space for other organisms to occupy and accelerating diversification further. The mollusks, a group that includes today's snails, clams, squid, and octopuses, were diversifying rapidly. Among the most dramatic of the early mollusks were the cephalopods, specifically the nautiloids, ancestors of today's nautilus. These animals developed hard, gas-filled shells that functioned as buoyancy devices, allowing them to control their position in the water column. The early Ordovician nautiloids included some that were enormous straight-shelled forms called orthosrates, some of which reached lengths of several meters, making them among the largest animals alive in their time. Imagine an orthosrated nautiloid, a straight cone of shell perhaps 2 meters long, trailing tentacles below it, propelling itself through the water with jets of expelled water, its large eyes scanning the water around it. This was the apex predator of the Ordovician Ocean, the successor to the radiosontans in the role of large, active, cephalic hunter. The nautiloids would go on to diversify further through the Paleozoic, coiling their shells into spirals, filling the oceans with their kind in enormous numbers, and leaving behind fossils so abundant that beds of orthosrate limestone, stone literally made of their compacted shells, can be found in rock formations across the world. Echinoderms, the group that includes today's starfish, sea urchins, and sea cucumbers, exploded in diversity during the Ordovician, producing a bewildering array of forms. Many of these early echinoderms were filter feeders, attached to the seafloor by stalks or anchored in the sediment, extending their arms or feeding tentacles up into the water to catch particles drifting by. Crinoids, sometimes called sea lilies, though they are animals, not plants, became extraordinarily abundant, forming meadows on the seafloor that swayed in the ocean currents. Blastoids, cystoids, and a variety of other echinoderm groups that have since gone extinct were also present, filling the water column and the seafloor with their elegantly symmetrical, 5-part bodies. The brachiopods, lamp shells, as they are sometimes called, two-shelled animals superficially resembling clams but belonging to an entirely different phylum, were one of the dominant groups of the Ordovician seafloor. They occupied much of the space that bivalve mollusks would later come to dominate, filtering food from the water with a specialized organ called a lophophore, attaching themselves to the seafloor with a fleshy stalk called a pedicle, or lying free on the sediment. During the Ordovician and for much of the Paleozoic that followed, brachiopods were among the most common marine animals on Earth, and their fossil shells are found in enormous quantities in Paleozoic limestone formations around the world. Bryozoans, tiny colonial animals that built intricate, branching or encrusting structures of calcium carbonate, were also becoming major components of Ordovician reef communities and seafloor environments. Each individual bryozoan animal, or zooid, was tiny, but the colonies they built could be elaborate and relatively large, creating habitat for other organisms and contributing significantly to the carbonate budget of the ocean. And then there were the graptolites, perhaps the most eccentric of the Ordovician's major groups, and one of the most useful to geologists studying this time period. Graptolites were colonial animals, each colony consisting of a series of small cups called theci arranged along one or more branches called stipes. The whole colony was encased in a tough, organic skeleton. Different graptolite species had different arrangements of stipes, some with many branches, some with just 2, some with only 1. They floated freely in the open ocean, drifting with currents, each tiny individual in its theca reaching out to filter food from the water. Graptolites evolved rapidly, and different species are found in different geological time intervals, making them extraordinarily useful as index fossils for dating the rocks in which they appear. They are also exceptionally well preserved in some formations, black shales deposited in low oxygen bottom waters where nothing was present to disturb or consume the settling organic material. In these black shales, graptolite fossils appear as delicate silvery or carbonaceous impressions, sometimes remarkably detailed. The Ordovician Ocean was, in a word, full of life in a way that the Cambrian Ocean had not been. The available ecological space was being occupied from top to bottom, from the sunlit surface to the dark benthos, from the edge of the continental shelf to the open ocean. And as the Ordovician progressed, one more group began to make its appearance, a group whose descendants would go on to conquer not just the ocean but eventually the land and the air as well. The vertebrates. The first vertebrates were fish, though fish is a word that covers enormous biological territory, and the earliest members of this lineage looked nothing like what most of us picture when we hear that word. They were jawless. They had no paired fins. They were small, flattened, and covered in a mosaic of bony plates and scales. They looked in some ways more like the bottom of a large beetle than like any fish alive today. These early jawless fish, the ostracoderms, appear in the fossil record during the Ordovician, though the very earliest vertebrate fossils are fragmentary and their precise dating is still being refined. What is clear is that by the Silurian period, which followed the Ordovician, fish were becoming a significant presence in the marine ecosystem, diversifying into a range of forms and beginning the evolutionary trajectory that would eventually produce every vertebrate animal on Earth. The jawlessness of these early fish is significant. Without jaws, the options for feeding are limited. You cannot bite, you cannot tear. What you can do is suck, using muscular contractions of the throat and a mouth that opens and closes to draw in water and the food particles it contains. Some ostracoderms may have been filter feeders. Others may have used their mouths to suction up sediment and sift through it for organic material. Some have been interpreted as possible parasites, using their sucking mouths to attach to larger organisms and feed on their blood or body fluids, a habit preserved today in the lampreys, which are among the very few jawless vertebrates that have survived to the present. The evolution of jaws, which happened in the Silurian period, roughly 430 million years ago, was one of the most consequential events in vertebrate history. Jaws opened up a completely new range of feeding possibilities. With jaws, a fish could seize and hold prey, could bite through shell or soft tissue, could process food in ways that were simply impossible before. It is believed that jaws evolved from modifications to the gill arches, the bony or cartilaginous arches that support the gills. Over evolutionary time, the foremost gill arch was gradually modified, enlarged, and repositioned until it became a biting structure. This is a transformation that is clearly visible in the developmental biology of modern vertebrates. Even today, the gill arches of vertebrate embryos are intimately connected to the development of the jaw and associated structures. The group of jawed fish that would go on to the greatest evolutionary success were the Actinopterygii, the ray-finned fish, and the Sarcopterygii, the lobe-finned fish groups that first diversified in the Silurian and Devonian. But before those groups achieved dominance, the Silurian and Devonian oceans were ruled by a group that has since been entirely replaced, the placoderms. The Silurian period, which lasted from roughly 444 to 419 million years ago, was in many ways a time of recovery and reorganization, because before the Silurian began, the Ordovician had ended with a catastrophe. The late Ordovician mass extinction was the second largest in Earth's history. In two distinct pulses, separated by perhaps a million years, somewhere between 60 and 85% of all marine species were lost. The first pulse was triggered by a rapid, severe glaciation event, glaciers spreading across the supercontinent Gondwana, locking up enormous volumes of water and ice and causing sea levels to drop dramatically. Shallow marine habitats, the richest and most diverse environments in the Ordovician Ocean, were drained away. Species that had evolved to live in specific conditions in those shallow seas found their habitats simply gone. The second pulse came as the glaciers retreated. As the ice melted, sea levels rose again, but the returning waters were cold and differently oxygenated than the shallow seas that had existed before. A second wave of extinctions followed, sweeping away many of the species that had survived the first pulse. The graptolites, the brachiopods, the trilobites, the nautiloids, the echinoderms, all of them suffered tremendous losses. Some groups were cut to a fraction of their former diversity. The ecological complexity that the Ordovician had built up over tens of millions of years was severely damaged. The reef ecosystems were largely destroyed, and yet life survived, not all of it, far from all of it, but enough. The survivors of the late Ordovician extinction carried the genetic and ecological legacy of everything that had come before, and into the Silurian they carried these things forward, diversifying again, rebuilding, finding new niches, filling in the spaces left by the organisms that had not made it. The Silurian saw the return of reef ecosystems, dominated now by different organisms than before, particularly by the stromatoporoids and various coral groups, but structurally comparable to what had existed in the Ordovician. The brachiopods diversified again. The crinoids recovered and spread across the seafloor in their millions, and new groups began to rise to prominence. Among the most significant new developments of the Silurian and the following Devonian period was the rise of fish, and not just the ostracoderms and early jawed forms, but the placoderms, heavily armored fish with bony plates covering the head and front part of the body, and with jaws made of bone rather than the cartilage that characterizes the sharks and their relatives. The placoderms were extraordinary animals. They ranged from small, flattened, bottom-feeding forms to massive open-water predators. They diversified into virtually every ecological role available to a fish, and for roughly 60 million years, through the Devonian period, they were the dominant vertebrates in the ocean. Some of them grew to truly impressive sizes. Dunkleosteus, perhaps the most famous placoderm, reached lengths of roughly 6 to 8 meters in larger estimates, though the exact size of the largest individuals is difficult to determine from the fragmentary remains that preserve the bony head shield but little of the rest of the body, which was soft and unpreserved. What makes Dunkleosteus particularly remarkable, beyond its size, is its bite. The placoderm jaw was structured differently from the jaws of modern fish. Rather than having true teeth, the jaws bore sharp, self-sharpening bony blades that formed from the jaw bones themselves. In Dunkleosteus, these blades were enormous, and biomechanical studies have suggested that the bite force may have been among the highest of any animal that has ever lived, capable of crushing the thick shells of ammonoids or the armor of other placoderms. The jaw also opened in an unusual way. Rather than just dropping the lower jaw, Dunkleosteus raised the entire skull relative to the lower jaw, creating an extremely rapid, wide gape that may have generated a powerful suction force capable of pulling prey toward the mouth as the jaws opened. The Devonian period, often called the Age of Fishes, was a time when the ocean was dominated by vertebrates in a way it had never been before. Fish were everywhere, placoderms and acanthodians and early ray-finned fish and the lobe-finned fish whose descendants would eventually crawl onto land. The shark lineage also diversified significantly during this period, with early sharks like Cladoslash appearing in the fossil record of Devonian marine deposits. But the Devonian was not only the age of fishes in the ocean. It was also the period during which life began, for the first time, to seriously colonize the land. The transition from water to land is one of the most dramatic stories in the history of life, and it connects directly to events in the marine world. It was the lobe-finned fish, the Sarcopterygii, that made the move. These fish had fins with a fleshy, muscular base supported by a bony internal skeleton, a skeleton that, remarkably, was homologous in its basic structure to the limb bones of all four-limbed vertebrates, the tetrapods. The upper arm bone, the radius and ulna, the wrist bones, their counterparts can be traced in the fins of lobe-finned fish like Eusthenopteran. And in certain Devonian lobe-finned fish, particularly creatures like Tiktaalik, discovered in Canada in 2004, the transition between fin and limb was already remarkably far along. Tiktaalik had a neck, something fish do not have. It could prop itself up on its front fins. It had ribs robust enough to support its body weight against gravity. It was in many ways already a land animal that happened still to live in water, or rather, an animal in the process of becoming a land animal, caught at one of the most important moments in the history of vertebrate life. But the move to land, remarkable as it was, did not diminish the ocean. Life on land was, for much of the Paleozoic, sparse and relatively simple compared to the teeming richness of the marine world. The real story continued in the sea, where the armored fish of the Devonian gave way to new groups, where the invertebrate fauna continued to diversify, and where the ecological web grew ever more complex and ever more elaborate. Among the most important groups in the Devonian and Carboniferous oceans were the ammonoids, cephalopod mollusks with coiled shells that would go on to become one of the most abundant and diverse groups of animals in Mesozoic oceans, though their story begins in the Paleozoic. The first ammonoids appear in the early Devonian, evolving from straight-shelled nautiloid ancestors. Over time, they developed their characteristic coiled shells, whose internal chambers were divided by complex, folded partitions called sutures. The pattern of these sutures, visible on the surface of the shell when the outer layer is eroded away, is so distinctive that it serves as a key identification tool for paleontologists working with ammonoid fossils. Ammonoids were active swimmers, propelling themselves through the water by jet propulsion and using their tentacles to catch prey. They ranged enormously in size across their long evolutionary history, from tiny forms just a few millimeters across to giants measuring well over a meter in diameter in the later Mesozoic. They diversified rapidly and evolved quickly, making them extremely useful for biostratigraphy, using fossils to date rock layers, because different ammonoid species are found in very specific, often narrow windows of geological time. The Carboniferous period, which followed the Devonian, was in many ways a time of extraordinary biological richness both on land and in the sea. On land, vast forests of giant club mosses and tree ferns covered the continents, creating the peat deposits that would eventually become the coal seams that define the period's name. In the sea, the ocean teemed with life. Shark diversity was particularly high during the Carboniferous, with an extraordinary range of forms that in some cases were quite different from the sharks we know today. One of the strangest was Helicoprion, a shark-like fish that has become famous for one of the most puzzling fossil structures ever discovered, a whorl of teeth coiled into a spiral like a buzzsaw that could reach quite large sizes. For many decades after its discovery, paleontologists disagreed intensely about where this Tooth-Whorl was located on the animal's body. Was it in the lower jaw, the upper jaw, somewhere else entirely? Was the spiral at the front of the mouth or somewhere further back? It was only through detailed analysis of the jaw structure, including CT scanning of associated fossils, that a consensus emerged. The Tooth-Whorl occupied the lower jaw, with the spiral coiling back into the throat as the animal grew, adding new teeth at the outer edge while the oldest teeth moved inward and downward in the spiral. What did Helicoprion use this extraordinary structure for? The current best interpretation is that it was used to process soft-bodied prey, ammonoids, squids, or similar animals. The spiral of teeth could have raked through the soft body of a cephalopod, shredding it and drawing it into the throat, while the hard shell was discarded or ejected. It is a highly specialized feeding tool, and it speaks to the degree of ecological specialization that had developed in the Carboniferous ocean, where predators were not just hunting but developing highly specific tools for dealing with specific kinds of prey. Another remarkable Carboniferous shark was Stethocanthus, a male of which had a distinctive anvil-shaped structure on its back, covered in teeth like denticles, along with a corresponding patch of denticles on the top of its head. The function of this peculiar structure has been debated extensively. It may have been used in mating displays, functioning as a kind of visual signal to potential mates. It may have had some role in anchoring the male to the female during copulation, or it may have had a defensive function of some kind. Whatever its purpose, it is a reminder that evolution does not only produce functional tools for catching prey or avoiding predators, It also produces elaborate structures shaped by the pressures of sexual selection and social competition. The Carboniferous Ocean was rich with echinoderms, particularly crinoids. During this period, crinoid meadows covered vast areas of the seafloor in some regions, their stalks rising from anchoring holdfasts into the water column, their feathery arms spread wide to catch particles drifting past. Crinoid limestone, rock composed largely of the compacted fragments of crinoid stalks and arms, is found in enormous quantities in Carboniferous rock formations around the world, testimony to how abundant these animals were. The Carboniferous also saw significant developments in the ecology of the coastal zone, the interface between sea and land. Large arthropods were becoming increasingly capable of exploiting this transitional environment. Eurypterids, sometimes called sea scorpions, though they were not true scorpions and lived in a variety of environments including fresh water, had been important members of Silurian and Devonian aquatic communities. Some Eurypterids grew to extraordinary sizes. Eucalypterus, found in Devonian deposits, may have reached lengths of 2.5 meters, making it one of the largest arthropods that has ever lived. These animals were apex predators in their environments, using their large, grasping appendages to catch fish and other prey. As the Paleozoic progressed, the Eurypterids declined in diversity and abundance, eventually going extinct before the end of the era. But the impulse to exploit the coastal zone and the edges of the sea did not disappear. Horseshoe crabs, which are not true crabs but rather relatives of arachnids, made their appearance during this general time period and have persisted remarkably, essentially unchanged to the present day. They are living fossils, representatives of an ancient Paleozoic body plan that has proven so functionally successful that it has not needed significant modification in hundreds of millions of years. The large arthropods that colonized the coastal margins were doing something ecologically important. They were connecting the marine and terrestrial worlds, moving organic material from one to the other, creating pathways for ecological exchange that would become increasingly important as more and more life established itself on land. By the time the Carboniferous gave way to the Permian period, roughly 300 million years ago, the marine ecosystem had become an extraordinarily complex and well-developed system. The Permian Ocean was rich with life at every level. Reef ecosystems built by sponges and corals and bryozoans created complex three-dimensional habitats. Fish, now dominated by early ray-finned forms and various shark lineages, since the placoderms had gone extinct at the end of the Devonian, were diverse and abundant. Ammonoids were diversifying rapidly. Brachiopods still dominated much of the soft-bottom seafloor. Crinoids swayed in their meadows. Trilobites, ancient survivors from the Cambrian, persisted in reduced diversity, still scuttling across the seafloor in some corners of the ocean. The Permian Ocean was also witnessing the emergence of groups that would go on to dominate the Mesozoic. The bivalve mollusks, clams, and their relatives were increasing in abundance and diversity, beginning to displace the brachiopods in some environments. Early ammonoids were diversifying into an extraordinary range of shell shapes and sizes. Marine reptiles were beginning to make their first tentative appearances in coastal environments, ancestors of the great sea reptiles that would dominate Mesozoic seas. The ocean was, in short, at one of the highest points of complexity and diversity it had ever reached. And it had reached this point through nearly 300 million years of continuous evolution, through explosions of diversity and devastating extinctions, through glaciations and warmings, through the rise and fall of whole ecological systems. It was a testament to the resilience and creativity of life, to the endless capacity of evolution to generate new solutions, new strategies, new forms of being. But the Permian Ocean was also heading toward the edge of a cliff. The climate of the Permian was variable and in many ways stressful. The supercontinent Pangaea, assembled from the collision of earlier continental masses, dominated the globe, and its interior was vast and arid, cut off from moderating oceanic influences. Ocean circulation patterns were affected by the particular arrangement of the continents, and there is evidence that oxygen levels in the deep ocean may have been declining through parts of the Permian, not enough yet to cause a crisis, but enough to create stress in some deep water communities. There were also significant changes in sea level through the Permian as climate fluctuated. The shallow epicontinental seas that had covered vast areas of the continental margins throughout much of the Paleozoic were shrinking, reduced as the continents merged into Pangaea and the patterns of subsidence and flooding changed. These shallow seas had been among the richest and most diverse marine environments, and their loss or reduction put pressure on the communities that depended on them. But these were manageable stresses, slow changes, the kind of pressures that life had faced before and survived. What was coming was something altogether different, something of a completely different order of magnitude. Far to the east of the assembled supercontinent Pangaea, in a region of the Earth that would eventually become Siberia, something was building. Deep in the mantle, a vast plume of superheated rock was pressing upward toward the crust, and roughly 252 million years ago, right at the end of the Permian period, that pressure found its release. What followed was not an explosion in the conventional sense, but something arguably more devastating for its sheer duration and scale. The largest volcanic event in the history of the Earth's known geological record. The Siberian Trap's eruptions lasted for tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years, flooding an area roughly equivalent to the modern country of Australia with layer upon layer of basaltic lava. But the lava itself was not the most destructive element. What the eruptions also injected into the atmosphere in quantities almost beyond comprehension were gases, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, methane, hydrogen chloride, and other compounds that altered the chemistry of both the atmosphere and the ocean in devastating ways. Carbon dioxide in enormous quantities drove a rapid and severe greenhouse warming. Global temperatures rose, estimates vary, but some models suggest rises of up to 10 degrees Celsius or more in average global temperatures. The ocean, absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, became more acidic. Ocean acidification attacks the chemistry of calcium carbonate, the material from which shells and skeletons are built. In a more acidic ocean, it becomes harder for organisms to build and maintain their calcium carbonate structures. Corals and reef builders suffered. Brachiopods suffered. Every calcifying organism in the ocean came under severe chemical stress. Simultaneously, the warming ocean held less dissolved oxygen. Oxygen solubility decreases as water temperature rises, and the warmer the ocean became, the less oxygen it could contain. In the deep ocean, oxygen levels dropped dramatically, possibly to levels at which most aerobic life could not survive. The stratification of the ocean increased. Warm, oxygen-poor surface water sat over cold, anoxic deep water, with little mixing between the two. In the deep ocean, the lights went out almost entirely. There may also have been releases of methane from the ocean floor from gas hydrates, ice-like structures in which methane molecules are trapped within a lattice of water ice, stable only under specific pressure and temperature conditions. As the ocean warmed, these hydrates became unstable and released their methane, which is itself a powerful greenhouse gas, accelerating the warming further in a catastrophic feedback loop. The result was the End-Permian mass extinction, the most severe biological catastrophe in the history of animal life on Earth. The Great Dying. The numbers are staggering. Estimates of the proportion of marine species that went extinct at the end of the Permian range from about 90 to 96%. Not 90 to 96% of individuals, 90 to 96% of species. Almost every lineage of marine life was devastated. The trilobites, which had survived every previous extinction event for nearly 300 million years, were entirely gone. The brachiopods, once so dominant that they had seemed almost indestructible, lost most of their diversity and would never again reach the ecological prominence they had held through the Paleozoic. The blastoids, the tabulate and rugose corals, dozens of echinoderm groups, gone. The ammonoids were reduced to perhaps a handful of surviving lineages, though they would eventually recover and diversify spectacularly in the Mesozoic that followed. In some marine rock sections from the End-Permian boundary, the change is visible in the most literal way. Below the boundary layer, the rock is full of fossil shells, diverse and abundant. Above the boundary layer, the rock is almost empty. Geologists call these dead zones sections of rock that were deposited in the immediate aftermath of the extinction, before life had had time to recover, where the sediment contains almost nothing but trace fossils and microbial structures. The ocean had been nearly sterilized. The recovery was slow, agonizingly slow by the standards of biological systems. For millions of years after the end of the Permian, the ocean remained impoverished, dominated by a few opportunistic species that could tolerate the harsh conditions. High temperatures, low oxygen, elevated acidity. Microbial mats, which had once been the dominant life form in the Precambrian, before the Cambrian Explosion, reappeared on the seafloor, filling in the ecological space left by the mass death of higher organisms. It was, in a way, a partial return to a much earlier world. The few survivors that made it through the Great Dying were tough. They were the organisms that could tolerate conditions that killed everything else, or they were the ones lucky enough to be in a local environment that was buffered from the worst of the global catastrophe, perhaps a deep cold water refuge or a shallow hydrothermal vent community. And from these survivors, these few, scattered, battered remnants of the enormous biological wealth of the Paleozoic Sea, the recovery slowly, painfully began. Among the survivors of the Great Dying, a few groups stand out for what they would go on to contribute to the history of life in the seas that followed. The ammonoids, despite being reduced to perhaps a handful of genera, recovered with remarkable speed, geologically speaking. Within a few million years of the extinction event, ammonoids were diversifying again, and within 10 to 15 million years, they had reached a diversity comparable to what they had achieved in the Permian. This rapid recovery reflects both the resilience of the group and its particular biological advantages. Ammonoids reproduced by producing enormous numbers of small, planktonic larvae, which meant that even a small surviving population could rapidly expand when conditions improved. The sharks also survived. Not all shark lineages made it through the Great Dying. Several groups were lost entirely, but the sharks as a whole demonstrated a resilience that has characterized their lineage throughout their history. The cartilaginous skeleton that defines the shark body plan, which some have suggested makes them vulnerable in the fossil record because cartilage rarely fossilizes, may actually have contributed to their survival ability. Cartilage requires less calcium to build than bone, potentially giving sharks an advantage in an ocean where calcium carbonate chemistry was disturbed. Among the bony fish, the ray-finned fish, the Actinopterygii, had also come through relatively intact, and in the early Triassic they began the diversification that would eventually make them the most species-rich group of vertebrates on Earth. In the Mesozoic oceans that followed the Permian extinction, the ray-finned fish would diversify into the vast array of forms that populate modern seas, from the flat, bottom-dwelling flounders to the fast, streamlined tuna, from the tiny, camouflaged seahorse to the enormous ocean sunfish. And among the invertebrates, the bivalve mollusks emerged from the Great Dying in a notably stronger position relative to the brachiopods, which had suffered so severely. Throughout the Triassic and beyond, bivalves would continue to increase their ecological dominance at the expense of brachiopods, eventually displacing them from most of the niches they had occupied through the Paleozoic. It is one of the great ecological transitions of marine history, invisible to the eye, but written clearly in the changing proportions of fossils through the rock record. The recovery of reef ecosystems after the Great Dying was particularly slow. Reefs require not just the survival of reef-building organisms, but the re-establishment of complex ecological communities. The corals or sponges that build the reef structure, the organisms that clean and maintain it, the grazers and browsers that keep algae from overwhelming it, the predators that control the grazers. It took tens of millions of years for reefs to fully recover after the End-Permian extinction, and when they did, they were built by different organisms, Scleractinian corals, the group that builds today's reefs, which were not present in the Paleozoic at all, having evolved in the early Triassic from ancestors that somehow survived the Great Dying. The tabulate and rugose corals that had built Paleozoic reefs were gone forever. It is worth pausing at this point and taking a long view of what we have traced so far. We began in a quiet microbial ocean, a world of chemical gradients and single cells drifting in the dark. We watched as the Cambrian Explosion erupted in biological diversity, producing animals with eyes and limbs and shells, hunters and prey locked in the first great arms race of complex life. We followed the diversification of the Ordovician, watched the rise of reefs and nautiloids and crinoid meadows, then witnessed the first great catastrophe of the End-Ordovician extinction. We traced the recovery through the Silurian and the age of fish in the Devonian, the first tetrapods crawling onto land, the extraordinary diversity of carboniferous sharks, and the vast crinoid meadows that covered the floor of carboniferous seas. We watched the Permian Ocean build itself to a peak of complexity and diversity unlike anything that had come before, and then watched the Great Dying sweep almost all of it away. In each of these chapters there are patterns, diversity builds, ecological relationships grow more complex, specialization increases, and then something, a glaciation, a volcanic eruption, a shift in ocean chemistry disrupts the system and diversity crashes. The survivors rebuild, new groups rise. And the cycle continues, each time building on what came before, each time producing something a little different, a little more complex, a little more strange and wonderful. The ocean is not a stable thing. It has never been stable. It is a dynamic system, always in motion, always changing, driven by forces from deep within the earth and from far above in the atmosphere. And life within it has always been shaped by those forces, pushed and pulled and sometimes nearly destroyed by them, but never quite eliminated, never quite silenced. The Paleozoic Sea was a 400 million year experiment in complexity. An experiment that in many ways laid the foundation for everything that came afterward, for the rich, teeming oceans of the Mesozoic and the Cenozoic, for the sharks and rays and bony fish that fill modern waters, for the mollusks and echinoderms and worms that populate every marine habitat on Earth today. The creatures of the Paleozoic Sea were strange. Many of them were bizarre beyond anything we might imagine without the fossil record to guide us, but they were not failures, they were pioneers. They built from a quiet, microbial beginning, a world of staggering beauty and complexity, a world that, despite everything the Earth could throw at it, found ways to persist, to recover, and to continue. And in the next part of this story, we will follow that recovery further, through the emergence of creatures that rebuilt the ocean after the Great Dying, through the innovations and specializations that carried life from the ruins of the Paleozoic into the world we live in today. But that is a story for the continuation that follows. For now, consider what the Paleozoic Sea has already told us. Consider the five-eyed Opabinia hovering over the Cambrian seafloor. Consider Anomalocaris circling in the warm, shallow water with its compound eyes searching. Consider the crinoid meadows of the Carboniferous, swaying in currents that no longer exist. Consider the Dunkleosteus, enormous and armored, its bone-bladed jaws able to crush anything it could catch. Consider the trilobites, those extraordinary animals that persisted through glaciations and extinctions and climate shifts for nearly 300 million years, only to finally fall at the last fence. These creatures were real. They lived and ate and died and evolved. They shaped each other through their interactions in ways that we are only beginning to understand. And the ocean they inhabited, that ancient, alien, endlessly transforming Paleozoic Sea, was the stage on which the most important chapters of life's story on this planet were first written. There is one more dimension of the Paleozoic Ocean that deserves attention before we move into the recovery from the Great Dying, and that is the vertical dimension. The ocean is not flat. It has depth in some places, enormous depth, and that depth creates different environments stacked on top of each other, each with its own particular characteristics and its own particular community of life. In the photic zone, the upper layer of the ocean where sunlight penetrates and photosynthesis is possible, conditions are very different from those in the deep water below. The photic zone is relatively warm, relatively well oxygenated, and rich in the primary producers, the phytoplankton that form the base of the marine food web. But it is also exposed, with nowhere to hide from predators that can see well in good light. Organisms in the photic zone must be able to avoid predation, which drives adaptations for speed, camouflage, armor, or the sheer reproductive abundance that allows some species to sustain heavy predation losses. Below the photic zone in the mesopelagic and deeper zones, conditions are colder, darker, and more oxygen-poor. Food is scarcer, it arrives mainly as organic material sinking from above, the marine snow of dead cells, fecal pellets, and fragments of larger organisms that drift slowly downward. The organisms that live here must be adapted to cold, darkness, and the perpetual search for scarce food. Many Paleozoic organisms that we know from fossils were inhabitants of these deeper, darker zones, though because deep water sediments are often subducted over geological time, their fossil record is less complete than that of shallow water communities. The vertical stratification of the ocean created a series of distinct ecological zones, each with its own character, and as the Paleozoic progressed, life increasingly specialized to exploit each of these zones. Planktonic organisms evolved specifically to live in the open water of the photic zone. Benthic organisms specialized for life on and in the seafloor. Mesopelagic organisms developed adaptations for the dim, cold, mid-water zone. And the exchanges between these zones, the daily vertical migration of zooplankton, the sinking of organic matter, the upwelling of nutrient-rich deep water, created connections between them that wove the entire ocean into a single, integrated ecological system. This vertical integration is one of the defining features of the Paleozoic ocean at its peak of diversity and complexity. It is the reason that even a small change in conditions at the surface, an increase in temperature, a decrease in oxygen, a change in ocean chemistry, can cascade through the entire system, affecting organisms at every depth and in every zone. It is the reason that the End-Permian extinction, driven largely by changes in atmospheric and surface ocean conditions, could reach all the way to the deep seafloor and eliminate communities living kilometers below the surface. And it is the reason that the recovery from such an extinction takes so long. Rebuilding a vertically integrated, ecologically complex ocean system requires not just the survival of species, but the re-establishment of all the connections between them, the food webs, the nutrient cycles, the behavioral interactions, the physical and chemical conditions that each community requires. It is not enough for the coral to survive if the reef fish that eat the algae which would otherwise smother the coral are gone. It is not enough for the ammonoid to persist if the plankton on which its larvae feed are too sparse to sustain them. Everything is connected, and everything must recover together in the right sequence and in sufficient abundance for the system to function again. The survivors of the Great Dying faced this challenge. They faced an ocean that was not just depleted of species but disrupted at the level of its fundamental ecological structure. And yet they persisted, and yet they recovered, and yet from those few remaining lineages, from those tough and lucky survivors of the worst catastrophe in the history of animal life, a new ocean slowly began to take shape. As we close this first part of our journey through the Paleozoic Sea, it is worth reflecting on what we have witnessed, not just as a scientific record, but as something almost impossible to fully comprehend in its scale and its drama. The Paleozoic era lasted roughly 290 million years. In that time, the continents moved, merged, and began to separate again. The climate swung from greenhouse to icehouse and back again, multiple times. The chemistry of the ocean changed dramatically more than once. Sea levels rose and fell by hundreds of meters. Mountains rose and eroded away. Oxygen levels in the atmosphere fluctuated dramatically. And through all of this, life in the sea did what it has always done. It adapted, it experimented, it failed, sometimes catastrophically, and then began again. It produced creatures of astonishing beauty and bizarre form, five-eyed predators and buzzing tooth spirals, cities of crinoids swaying in deep time currents, vast reefs built by organisms that no longer exist, armored fish with bone-blade jaws cruising through warm Devonian seas. The Paleozoic Sea was not a prelude. It was not merely a rehearsal for the modern ocean. It was its own thing, complete and extraordinary in itself, a world as rich and complex and strange as anything that has come before or since. And the fact that we can know it at all, that from fragments of stone, from the patient work of paleontologists over generations, we can reconstruct this vanished world with such detail and such wonder, is itself one of the most remarkable things about the story of life on Earth. The ocean today carries within it the legacy of everything the Paleozoic Sea built and lost and built again. Every shark that glides through modern water carries the legacy of those early Devonian forms. Every snail and every crab carries some deep molecular memory of the Cambrian Explosion. Every coral reef, every crinoid on the deep seafloor, every ammonite-descended nautilus drifting in the dark Pacific, all of them are heirs to the Paleozoic Sea and all its creatures, bizarre and magnificent and utterly irreplaceably gone. This is where we pause at the threshold of recovery, at the beginning of what comes next. The great dying has happened. The Paleozoic is over. The ocean is empty and dark and struggling, but life remains. And life, as it has always done, will find a way forward. Join us in Part 2, where we will follow that recovery through the Triassic and into the long shadow the Paleozoic casts over everything that came after it, and through the specific stories of the creatures whose resilience and adaptability laid the foundations for the ocean we know today. We left the Paleozoic Sea at its darkest moment. The great dying had swept through the ocean like nothing that had come before it, a catastrophe so total, so comprehensive in its destruction, that the word extinction barely seems adequate to describe what happened. Nearly all of it was gone. The trilobites, those ancient and enduring survivors of every previous catastrophe for nearly 300 million years, had finally been silenced. The rugose and tabulate corals that had built the reefs of the Paleozoic were gone. The blastoids were gone. Dozens upon dozens of lineages that had diversified and specialized and filled the ocean with their presence through the long march of Paleozoic time, gone. The sea floor, which had once been carpeted with the extraordinary complexity of a mature, richly interconnected ecosystem, was nearly bare, but not quite bare, not entirely. And in that not quite, in that thin margin between extinction and survival, lay the entire future of the ocean. Life was still there. Diminished almost beyond recognition, reduced to a fraction of its former diversity, struggling in waters that were too warm and too acidic and too low in oxygen for comfort. But alive, and alive means evolving, alive means adapting. Alive means that the process which had been running without pause since the first self-replicating molecules assembled themselves in the ancient Precambrian ocean had not stopped, would not stop. What follows is the story of how the ocean came back. How those survivors, the tough, the lucky, the ecologically flexible, rebuilt what had been lost, and how in rebuilding it they created something new, something that carried within it all the lessons of the Paleozoic, encoded not in memory or intention but in the deep language of genetics and ecology, and used those lessons to forge the foundations of the modern ocean. This is the continuation of the story of the Paleozoic Sea, but it is also the beginning of everything that came after. To understand the recovery, you first have to understand the full scale of what was lost and what, remarkably, was not. Because even in the face of 90 to 96% species extinction, some groups came through with enough diversity and ecological capacity to serve as the seeds of recovery. And the particular groups that survived tell us something important about what kinds of biological strategies are most effective in the face of catastrophic, rapidly changing environmental conditions. The ammonoids, the coiled, chambered cephalopods that had diversified so spectacularly through the later Paleozoic, were among the most dramatic examples of both near destruction and rapid recovery. At the End-Permian boundary, the ammonoids appear to have been reduced to perhaps as few as 2 or 3 surviving lineages, a catastrophic reduction from the enormous diversity they had achieved in the Permian. For a brief time, the entire future of cephalopod diversification rested on the survival of just a handful of species. What saved them, at least in part, was their reproductive strategy. Like many marine invertebrates, ammonoids reproduced by releasing enormous numbers of tiny planktonic larvae into the water column. Each individual could produce thousands or even millions of offspring in a single reproductive event. This strategy is expensive in terms of energy, and the vast majority of larvae die before reaching adulthood, eaten by predators, starved in areas of low productivity, swept into unfavorable conditions by currents. But it has one enormous advantage in the context of a mass extinction. Even a tiny surviving population, if it contains reproductively capable individuals, can produce vast numbers of offspring, and if conditions improve even temporarily, those offspring can establish new populations rapidly. The ammonoid recovery is genuinely astonishing to trace in the geological record. In rock sections from the earliest Triassic, the period immediately following the End-Permian extinction, the record is devastatingly sparse. A few simple, smooth-shelled forms in limited numbers, and then within perhaps 2 to 3 million years, the ammonoids begin to diversify again. New shell shapes appear, new patterns of ornamentation, new genera, new families. By the Middle Triassic, ammonoids had reached a diversity that rivaled what they had achieved in the Permian, and they were well on their way to the explosive diversification that would make them one of the dominant animal groups of the Mesozoic ocean. This rapid recovery from near extinction is one of the most remarkable evolutionary stories in the fossil record. It speaks to the underlying biological potential of the ammonoid body plan, to the flexibility and versatility of a design that could be rapidly modified by selection to fill new ecological roles. And it speaks to the importance of surviving at all. The ammonoids that made it through the Great Dying were not necessarily the most complex or the most specialized members of their group. They may have been in some sense the most generalized, the forms with the broadest ecological tolerances, capable of surviving across a wider range of conditions than their more specialized contemporaries. This is a pattern that repeats itself throughout the history of life and through the Paleozoic in particular. In times of stability and ecological richness, specialization is rewarded. Specialists can outcompete generalists in the specific conditions they are adapted to, and so ecosystems tend to fill up with highly specialized forms as they mature. But in times of rapid environmental change, specialization becomes a liability. The specialist is adapted to conditions that no longer exist, and it cannot adjust quickly enough to survive the new reality. The generalist, by contrast, may be less efficient under normal conditions, but when conditions change dramatically, its broader tolerances become a crucial advantage. The sharks demonstrate this principle vividly. Sharks, the cartilaginous fish that form one of the great lineages of vertebrate evolution, had been present in the ocean since at least the Devonian period, more than 400 million years ago. Through the Carboniferous and Permian, they had diversified into an extraordinary range of forms, including the bizarre Helicoprion with its Tooth-Whorl jaw, the anvil-backed Stethocanthus, and many others whose fossils record in stone a diversity that seems almost inexhaustible. Many of these specialized shark lineages did not survive the Great Dying. The more peculiar, more specialized forms, the ones that had evolved very specific body plans for very specific ecological roles, were among the casualties. But the sharks as a whole came through. The basic shark body plan, streamlined, efficient, adaptable, proved robust enough to survive even the End-Permian catastrophe. And in the Triassic that followed, the surviving shark lineages began to diversify again, gradually, filling in some of the enormous ecological space left vacant by the extinction. The sharks that emerged from this recovery were, in many cases, recognizably similar in their basic biology to the sharks we know today. The fundamental design, cartilaginous skeleton, powerful jaws with replaceable teeth, streamlined body with a heterocircle tail, had proved itself so effective over hundreds of millions of years that it required no fundamental revision. What changed was the specific details, the shape of the teeth, the proportions of the body, the particular prey taken, the specific habitats occupied. But the basic blueprint was stable. Sharks are, in the most genuine sense, a successful design. Not because they have failed to evolve, they have evolved continuously, and modern sharks are in many ways very different from their Paleozoic ancestors, but because the core architecture that underlies their biology has proven robust enough to survive every catastrophe that the Earth has thrown at it for more than 400 million years. This is why sharks are sometimes described as living fossils, a term that is somewhat misleading because it implies stasis and an absence of evolution that is not accurate. But what it captures is the profound stability of the basic shark body plan across deep time. The oceans have changed enormously. The continents have moved. The climate has shifted through glaciations and greenhouse episodes. Mass extinctions have swept away the majority of marine life multiple times. And yet the sharks are still there. Among the other vertebrate survivors of the Great Dying, the ray-finned fish deserve particular attention because their post-Permian recovery would ultimately lead them to an ecological dominance in the ocean that they still hold today. The Actinopterygii, the ray-finned fish, had been diversifying since the Devonian, but through most of the Paleozoic they were less dominant than the various groups of jawed fish and sharks that shared the ocean with them. The End-Permian extinction changed this balance significantly. In the early Triassic, ray-finned fish were among the organisms that recovered relatively quickly from the extinction, and in the recovering ecosystems of the Triassic they found vast ecological opportunities. The niches left vacant by the massive losses of the extinction event were there to be filled, and the ray-finned fish, which had already demonstrated considerable ecological versatility during the Paleozoic, were well positioned to fill many of them. The story of ray-finned fish diversification through the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous periods and into the Cenozoic is one of the most spectacular examples of adaptive radiation in the history of vertebrates. Starting from a relatively limited set of body plans at the beginning of the Triassic, the ray-finned fish diversified into the enormous range of forms that today occupies virtually every aquatic habitat on Earth, from coral reefs to the deep ocean, from tropical rivers to polar seas, from tiny transparent gobies to enormous ocean sunfish weighing a metric ton. The teleosts, the most derived and diverse group of ray-finned fish, comprise more than 30,000 described species today, representing roughly half of all vertebrate species on the planet. But all of that extraordinary diversification was built on the foundation laid in the Paleozoic and on the survival of a few ray-finned fish lineages through the Great Dying. Without those survivors, without those few fish that managed to persist through the worst environmental catastrophe in the history of animal life, the modern ocean would be a profoundly different place. The recovery of the ocean after the Great Dying was not just a biological story, it was also a physical and chemical story. For the ocean to support diverse, complex life again, its basic chemistry needed to stabilize. The extreme acidity and low oxygen levels of the immediate post-extinction world needed to moderate. The temperature needed to come down from the lethal peaks of the extinction event itself. This stabilization happened gradually, as the volcanic activity responsible for the catastrophe wound down and the carbon cycle slowly re-equilibrated. Carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere decreased as the ocean and terrestrial ecosystems absorbed carbon. Temperatures moderated. Oxygen levels in the ocean gradually recovered as photosynthetic productivity increased and deep circulation patterns were re-established. The chemistry of the surface ocean became less hostile to the formation of calcium carbonate structures, making it possible again for organisms to build shells and skeletons. The time frame for this stabilization is difficult to pin down precisely because the geological record of the early Triassic is itself somewhat sparse and challenging to interpret. But it appears that even in the first million years after the extinction, some degree of environmental amelioration was occurring, enough to allow the first tentative diversification of opportunistic survivors. And by the Middle Triassic, roughly 5 to 8 million years after the extinction event, the pace of recovery was clearly accelerating. One of the most important early markers of recovery in the marine ecosystem was the return of reef communities. Reefs are complex, architecturally elaborate ecosystems that require not just the reef-building organisms, but a whole community of associated species to function properly. They take a long time to establish and are among the first things lost in a major extinction event and among the last to fully recover. In the immediate aftermath of the Great Dying, there were no reefs. The shallow, carbonate platform environments that had supported the Permian reefs were empty of their former inhabitants, and the environmental conditions of the early Triassic, warm, acidic, low oxygen, were not conducive to reef growth in any case. For perhaps 5 to 10 million years, reefs were essentially absent from the global ocean. When reefs did begin to reappear in the Middle Triassic, they were built by different organisms than before. The tabulate and rugose corals that had been the primary reef builders through much of the Paleozoic were gone. In their place, a new group of corals, the Scleractinia, sometimes called the stony corals, began to build reef structures. These corals had evolved sometime in the early Triassic from soft-bodied ancestors that had survived the extinction, and they built their skeletons from aragonite, a form of calcium carbonate, in a different crystalline structure from the corals that had come before. The Scleractinian corals are the same group that builds the coral reefs of the modern ocean. Their appearance in the Triassic marks the beginning of a continuous lineage of reef building that has persisted, with interruptions, to the present day. In this sense, the coral reefs we know today, the Great Barrier Reef, the reefs of the Caribbean and the Indo-Pacific, are the direct descendants, ecologically speaking, of the reef communities that first re-established themselves in the Middle Triassic Ocean, built by organisms that evolved in the ruins of the Great Dying. While the recovery of the ocean's communities was proceeding in the Triassic, another remarkable development was underway: the return of large vertebrate predators to the marine environment. The end of the Paleozoic had seen the decline and extinction of the placoderms, the great armored fish that had been apex predators in Devonian seas. The sharks had survived but were not yet at their maximum diversity. And a completely new category of marine predator was beginning to appear, one whose ancestors had very recently lived on land. The marine reptiles of the Triassic represent one of the most dramatic examples of evolutionary reversal in the history of vertebrates. Animals whose tetrapod ancestors had made the laborious transition from sea to land in the Devonian and Carboniferous, now reversing that journey and returning to the ocean. The ecological opportunity created by the Great Dying, a vast, nearly empty ocean with an enormous supply of food for any large predator capable of exploiting it, made the marine environment powerfully attractive, and several different reptile lineages made the transition independently and at roughly the same time. The ichthyosaurs were among the first and most dramatic of these returnees. Evolving from unknown land-dwelling reptile ancestors sometime in the earliest Triassic, the ichthyosaurs developed into fully marine animals with extraordinary speed. By the Middle Triassic, they had already evolved a streamlined, fish-like body form that was highly effective for fast swimming in open water. By the late Triassic, some ichthyosaurs had become enormous. Shanosaurus, from Triassic deposits, reached lengths of perhaps 15 meters, making it one of the largest animals that had lived in the ocean since the Paleozoic. The ichthyosaurs were air-breathing reptiles that could not return to land to give birth, and they solved this problem by becoming viviparous, giving birth to live young in the water. Fossil evidence for this remarkable fact exists in the form of specimens preserved in the act of giving birth, with small juvenile ichthyosaurs visible within or just emerging from the adult's body cavity. These animals were in every functional sense the dolphins of the Mesozoic, fast, intelligent presumably, visually acute, warm-blooded to some degree, air-breathing, and living in social groups or at least sharing the same productive marine environments. The plesiosaurs were the other great dynasty of Mesozoic marine reptiles, and they took a very different approach to oceanic life. Rather than the torpedo-shaped body of the ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs had broad, relatively flat bodies propelled by four large, paddle-like flippers, a unique locomotor style that has no exact parallel in the modern ocean. Two distinct body forms evolved within the plesiosaur lineage. The long-necked plesiosaurs proper, with small heads on extremely elongated necks that might reach half or more of the animal's total body length, and the pliosaurs with very short necks and enormous, massive heads bearing powerful jaws and huge, interlocking teeth. The long-necked plesiosaurs were probably pursuit predators of fish and cephalopods, using their long necks to lunge at prey with speed and precision. The pliosaurs were apex predators of the first order, animals capable of taking virtually any prey in the Mesozoic ocean, with bite forces that have been estimated in the largest forms at levels comparable to or exceeding any other predator in Earth's history. But all of this, the ichthyosaurs, the plesiosaurs, the vast diversification of Mesozoic marine life, was built directly upon what the Paleozoic had created and what the survivors of the Great Dying had preserved. The ecological architecture that made a complex marine ecosystem possible, the relationships between plankton producers and zooplankton consumers and fish and large predators, the patterns of vertical stratification and horizontal zonation, the reef communities and the open ocean communities and the deep water communities, all of this had its roots in the Paleozoic. The Mesozoic ocean was not a new creation. It was a reconstruction, and in many ways an elaboration, of what the Paleozoic had built over nearly 300 million years. It is worth returning now to a theme that runs through the entire story of the Paleozoic Sea, the theme of ecological complexity and what it means for the resilience of a biological system. An ecologically complex system, one with many species occupying many different niches, with multiple pathways for energy to flow through the food web, with many different kinds of relationships between organisms including predation, competition, mutualism, and parasitism, is in some ways more vulnerable to disruption than a simple system. More things can go wrong, more species can be lost, and their loss can cascade through the system, affecting other species that depended on them. In a simple system with few species, each loss is more isolated, but ecological complexity also confers resilience in another sense. A complex food web has many alternative pathways. If one species of prey disappears, a predator with broad enough dietary habits can switch to another. If one kind of producer declines, another can increase to take its place. The redundancy built into a complex ecological system, the fact that multiple species may fill overlapping ecological roles, provides a buffer against the loss of any single component. The tragedy of mass extinctions like the Great Dying is that they hit complexity so hard. When 90% or more of species are lost in a geologically brief interval, the redundancy disappears. The alternative pathways are cut off. The system loses not just species but the ecological relationships between them, the connections that took millions of years to build and that are not rebuilt simply by the survival of the component species. A species can persist without its predator, without its prey, without its competitor, but it cannot persist without its food source, and it cannot thrive without the broader community of organisms that shapes the physical and chemical environment in which it lives. This is why the recovery from mass extinctions is so slow. Not because evolution is slow, the ammonoid recovery shows that evolution can be extremely rapid when conditions favor rapid change, but because rebuilding ecological complexity requires not just the evolution of new species and the diversification of surviving lineages, but the re-establishment of the intricate web of relationships that makes a mature ecosystem function. And that takes time, often millions of years. As we look back at the full sweep of the Paleozoic Sea, from the quiet Ediacaran world through the Cambrian Explosion, the Ordovician diversification, the age of fish in the Devonian, the coal age ocean of the Carboniferous, and the final catastrophe of the Great Dying, certain themes emerge with striking clarity. The first is the extraordinary creativity of evolution. Given time and environmental pressure, natural selection can produce body forms and biological strategies of almost incomprehensible variety. The Paleozoic Sea was not just diverse, it was inventive in the deepest possible sense. It tried things that had never been tried before and have not been tried since. 5 eyes, Tooth-Whorls, grasping proboscises, crystalline compound eyes made of calcite. Body plans so unlike anything living today that paleontologists spent decades arguing about their basic anatomy. This creativity was not random, it was directed by selection, by the specific pressures of specific environments at specific times. But the sheer range of solutions that evolution found to the basic challenges of existence, how to feed, how to move, how to avoid being eaten, how to reproduce, is a testament to the almost unlimited potential of the evolutionary process when given sufficient time and variation to work with. The second theme is the importance of extinction. This may seem paradoxical. Extinction is, after all, the permanent end of a lineage, the silencing of a biological experiment that can never be repeated. But the history of the Paleozoic Sea makes clear that extinction is also a creative force. Every mass extinction swept away not just species but ecological incumbents, the groups that had dominated specific niches and by their dominance prevented other groups from diversifying into those niches. The end of the Paleozoic's dominant groups, the trilobites, the rugose corals, the placoderms, the blastoids, opened ecological space that had been occupied for hundreds of millions of years and allowed new groups to evolve and diversify in ways that would not have been possible in a world still dominated by their predecessors. The third theme is resilience. Not the resilience of any individual species or lineage, for species and lineages are demonstrably fragile in the face of environmental catastrophe, but the resilience of life itself, of the evolutionary process, of the capacity for biological diversity to rebuild itself from whatever fragments survive. Again and again through the Paleozoic, the ocean was devastated and rebuilt. Each time, what rebuilt itself was different from what had been lost. Each time, the reconstruction was built on whatever survived, and each time it grew more complex, more ecologically sophisticated, more richly interconnected than what had existed before. This resilience is not unlimited. The Great Dying came close, very close, to being too much. A few percentage points more of extinction, and the survivors might have been too few and too ecologically isolated to rebuild anything recognizable. But close is not all the way, and the ocean recovered. Different, diminished for a time, stripped of much of its former glory, but alive, and in time, magnificent again. The story of specific organisms and their adaptations through the Paleozoic offers some of the most remarkable windows into how evolution responds to ecological opportunity and constraint. One such story is that of the cephalopods, the group that includes not only the ammonoids we have discussed, but also the nautiloids, the belemnites, and the ancestors of the modern squid, octopus, and cuttlefish. The cephalopods are, in evolutionary terms, a group of extraordinary ingenuity. Their basic body plan, a mollusk essentially, that has evolved to be an active, fast-moving predator by repurposing the molluscan foot into a set of grasping tentacles, and developing jet propulsion for rapid movement, has proven remarkably adaptable across hundreds of millions of years. The shell, which in early cephalopods was a functional buoyancy device, has been modified in every conceivable direction by different lineages. Coiled into a spiral in the ammonoids and nautiloids, straightened into a cone in the orthoceratids, internalized and reduced to a thin internal support in the belemnites, and eventually lost entirely in the modern octopus. Through the Paleozoic, the cephalopods occupied the role of the ocean's primary active invertebrate predators, the animals that could move fast, coordinate their tentacles to seize prey, and use relatively sophisticated sensory systems to navigate and hunt in three-dimensional space. The nautiloids of the Ordovician, with their long straight shells and tentacled heads, were among the first large animals to exploit the open water as pursuit predators. The ammonoids that diversified through the later Paleozoic occupied a range of ecological roles, some probably active hunters, others perhaps more like modern nautiluses, scavenging and opportunistically feeding on whatever was available. What makes the cephalopod story particularly poignant in the context of the Paleozoic Sea is the fate of the ammonoids after their Triassic recovery. Having survived the Great Dying against all odds, the ammonoids went on to an even more spectacular phase of diversification in the Jurassic and Cretaceous. They evolved into forms with extraordinarily elaborate shell ornamentation, ribs, spines, knobs, and nodes decorating their shells in patterns of astonishing geometric complexity. Some evolved heteromorph shells that were uncoiled or partially coiled or twisted into helical spirals or paperclip shapes. The variety of ammonoid shell forms in the Cretaceous Ocean represents one of the most extreme examples of morphological diversification in any single group of animals. And then, at the end of the Cretaceous period, 66 million years ago, the ammonoids were gone. A bolide impact, an asteroid or comet striking the Earth, combined with its own catastrophic environmental effects and wiped them out entirely, along with the non-avian dinosaurs and the majority of other species on Earth. The ammonoids, which had survived the Great Dying, could not survive the end Cretaceous extinction. They were gone. The nautiloids, the other great cephalopod lineage, did survive, and their descendants, the modern nautiluses, still swim in the deep waters of the Pacific and Indian Oceans today. They are living representatives of a lineage that has been present in the ocean for nearly 500 million years, a connection to the Paleozoic Sea that is still alive and still swimming. The story of the trilobites deserves a final, more extended meditation before we leave the Paleozoic behind. Because of all the creatures of the Paleozoic Sea, the trilobites are perhaps the most emblematic, the group that most completely captures both the extraordinary richness of Paleozoic marine life and the finality of its end. Trilobites first appeared at the very beginning of the Cambrian period, roughly 520 million years ago. From the moment of their appearance in the fossil record, they were already diverse, multiple orders, with distinctly different body plans, appear simultaneously in early Cambrian rock sections, suggesting that the earliest diversification of the trilobite lineage either happened very rapidly or predates the preservation of fossils in accessible rock. Over the following 300 million years, the trilobites diversified into every marine habitat and ecological role available to a benthic or swimming arthropod. They were predators and prey. They were filter feeders and scavengers. They burrowed through sediment and walked on the seafloor and swam through the water column. They ranged from the tropics to polar seas, from shallow tidal flats to relatively deep water. They were found on every continent and in every marine environment that the Paleozoic had to offer. The diversity of trilobite body forms across their 300 million year history is staggering. Agnostida, tiny and blind, floated in the plankton of Cambrian seas, their uniformity suggesting either that they were highly specialized or that they were extremely generalized, depending on the interpretation. Asaphida included large, streamlined trilobites with eyes positioned for maximum visual coverage, some of which could enroll completely, tucking their pygidium under their cephalon like a living armored ball. Lichida produced some of the most extravagantly ornamented trilobites known to science, forms with enormous, branching spines projecting from every surface, so elaborate that they seem more like the imaginings of a fever dream than the product of natural selection. The Spherixocene trilobites developed a remarkable ability to tuck their bodies into tight balls when threatened, a defense that required specific anatomical modifications to the articulation between thoracic segments and between the thorax and pygidium, ensuring that the enrollment was both complete and lockable. Some trilobites evolved eyes of extraordinary complexity, including the schizochrole eyes of Phacopid trilobites, in which each lens was separated from its neighbors by a thick, opaque membrane, potentially reducing optical interference between lenses and improving vision in different ways from the holochrole eyes of other trilobite groups. And then there were the Odontoplurida trilobites whose body surfaces were covered in long, sharp spines projecting in every direction. Dicranurus monstratus, a species whose name is, if anything, an understatement, bore enormous curved horns projecting from above its eyes and a forest of spines across its thorax and pygidium, making it look like something a special effects artist might design for a science fiction film. These spines were almost certainly defensive, making the trilobite very difficult to swallow, or perhaps very difficult to approach at all. They may also have played roles in camouflage, breaking up the animal's outline against a complex background of corals and sponges. Trilobites survived the late Ordovician mass extinction, though many lineages were lost. They survived the late Devonian extinction, which eliminated the placoderms and many other Devonian groups, again with losses but not annihilation. They made it through the Carboniferous and into the Permian, reduced now to far fewer families than in their Paleozoic heyday, but still present, still living and moving and feeding on the Permian seafloor. And then they ran out of time. The End-Permian extinction was too much. No trilobite lineage survived the Great Dying. After nearly 300 million years, a span of time longer than the current age of the dinosaurs and the subsequent mammalian age combined, the last trilobite died. Somewhere in the Permian Ocean, perhaps on a seafloor that was growing too warm, too acidic, too low in oxygen, the last individual of the last species of this extraordinary group came to the end of its life. And that was that, no more trilobites, ever. It is a loss that, even across the vast distance of 250 million years, carries a particular weight. The trilobites were not just abundant, they were extraordinary. And their extinction tells us, as vividly as anything in the fossil record, that there are no guarantees in the history of life. That persistence through many millions of years does not confer immunity. That biological success, however spectacular and prolonged, is always conditional on the continuation of conditions that make it possible. The coastal zone, the interface between the sea and the emerging terrestrial world, was one of the most dynamic and ecologically significant environments of the Paleozoic. Through much of the Paleozoic, the coastline was the frontier of life's expansion, the boundary across which organisms were gradually, haltingly, making the transition from a fully marine existence to one that could include time out of the water. The arthropods were pioneers in this transition. Eurypterids, those large, sometimes enormous, scorpion-like arthropods that had been significant predators in Silurian and Devonian aquatic environments, appear to have been capable of at least temporary excursions onto land or into very shallow, intertidal environments. Their bodies, with their jointed limbs and waterproof exoskeleton, were already well suited for dealing with the challenge of resisting desiccation and supporting body weight against gravity, and the fossil record includes tracks and trails that have been interpreted as evidence of terrestrial movement. The horseshoe crabs, chelicerates related to spiders and scorpions rather than true crabs, also appear in the Paleozoic and have persisted with minimal change to the present. They are remarkable animals in many ways. They breathe using book gills, which are closely analogous to the book lungs of terrestrial arachnids, suggesting a deep evolutionary connection between marine and terrestrial respiratory strategies. They mate in the intertidal zone, gathering in enormous numbers on sandy beaches to spawn. Their blood contains a remarkable clotting agent, limulus ambisite lysate, that is extraordinarily sensitive to bacterial contamination and has been used in medical applications for decades. The horseshoe crab's survival across the End-Permian extinction and every subsequent catastrophe is one of the most remarkable biological stories of persistence in the entire fossil record. The modern horseshoe crab looks essentially identical to its Paleozoic ancestors, a morphological conservatism so extreme that it challenges our intuitive expectations about how much organisms should change over geological time. It suggests that the horseshoe crab body plan, whatever its precise advantages, has been good enough, in all the environments the animal has occupied over the past 400 or more million years, that no fundamental modification has been necessary. This extreme morphological conservatism is actually more common in marine invertebrates than in terrestrial animals, and this makes a certain ecological sense. The basic physico-chemical environment of the shallow marine zone, tidal, seasonal, variable but within certain limits, has been more stable over geological time than most terrestrial environments. The same kinds of challenges have recurred in roughly the same ways across deep time. And organisms well adapted to those recurring challenges have, in many cases, not needed to change fundamentally because the challenges have not changed fundamentally. The ecological niche concept, the idea that each species occupies a specific role in an ecosystem, defined by its food sources, its predators, its habitat requirements, its behavioral patterns, and its interactions with other species, is essential for understanding the Paleozoic Sea. And one of the most striking features of Paleozoic marine ecology, visible from the fossil record, is the progressive elaboration of niche structure over time. In the early Cambrian Ocean, the number of distinct ecological niches was relatively limited. There were primary producers, primary consumers, and a few levels of predation. The food web was real but relatively simple, a few food chains rather than a complex web. Ecological roles were not highly differentiated, and many organisms were ecological generalists compared to their later descendants. As the Paleozoic progressed, this picture changed dramatically. The number of distinct ecological roles increased. Predators became more specialized, some for particular prey types, some for particular habitats, some for particular hunting strategies. Prey organisms evolved increasingly specific defensive adaptations. Filter feeders diversified to exploit different size ranges of particles and different positions in the water column. Deposit feeders evolved to process different types of sediment. Parasites and other intimate associations between species developed. The food web grew from a simple set of chains into a genuinely complex network, with multiple pathways connecting producers to apex predators, and with an enormous range of species occupying positions at every level. This progressive ecological complexity, this filling in of the ecological space with ever more specialized and ever more numerous players, is one of the most important trends in the history of marine life. It represents the accumulation of ecological information, the evolutionary learning, encoded in the genomes and behaviors of millions of species, about how to exploit the resources of the ocean efficiently without destroying the productive base on which everything depends. A mature, complex ecosystem is, in a sense, a biological solution to the problem of living in a world of limited resources. By specializing, different organisms can exploit different parts of the resource base without directly competing for the same thing. By creating complex webs of interaction, ecosystems channel energy through many different pathways, reducing waste and increasing the proportion of available energy that is actually captured and used by living things. The Paleozoic Sea, over its nearly 300 million years, was the most extended experiment in the development of marine ecological complexity that the Earth has ever run. The deep ocean of the Paleozoic is one of the least known chapters of the story, simply because deep sea sediments are among the most difficult to access from the geological record. As oceanic plates move and are subducted under continental margins, the sedimentary record of the deep ocean floor is largely destroyed. What survives is fragmentary, occasional slices of deep-sea rock caught up in mountain-building events and preserved in continental rocks, or rare deposits of deep-water sediments that somehow escaped subduction. From these fragmentary records and from our understanding of modern deep-sea communities, we can construct a partial picture of what life in the deep Paleozoic ocean might have looked like. The deep sea in any era is defined by cold temperatures, high pressure, complete darkness, and scarce food. These conditions select strongly for certain kinds of adaptations: slow metabolisms, which reduce energy requirements in a food-poor environment; bioluminescence, used for communication and predation in a world without sunlight; sensory systems oriented toward detecting chemical and mechanical signals rather than light; and reproductive strategies that deal with the challenge of finding mates in a vast, dark, sparsely populated environment. Many of these adaptations are so strongly linked to the deep sea environment that they appear to have evolved independently multiple times in different lineages, a form of convergent evolution driven by the consistent nature of the challenge. It seems likely that similar adaptations existed in the deep Paleozoic ocean, though direct evidence is sparse. What we do know is that by at least the Cambrian and Ordovician, organisms were living at depths well beyond the photic zone, and that deep water communities were distinct from shallow water ones in their composition and ecology. The connection between the deep ocean and the shallow zones above it was maintained through the sinking of organic material, the marine snow, from productive surface waters to the seafloor. This connection was crucial for nutrient cycling throughout the Paleozoic, as it still is today. The sinking of organic matter carries carbon and other nutrients from the surface to the deep, while upwelling currents bring nutrient-rich deep water back to the surface, fueling productivity. This biological pump, the cycling of nutrients between surface and deep driven by the activities of living organisms, was operating throughout the Paleozoic and was one of the fundamental ecological mechanisms through which the marine food web functioned. Among the more intriguing questions about the Paleozoic ocean is the degree to which marine organisms of the era had behavioral complexity comparable to modern animals. Behavior is extremely difficult to determine from the fossil record. Fossils preserve morphology, and morphology only indirectly reflects behavior. But there are clues. Trace fossils, the tracks, trails, burrows, and feeding traces left by organisms in sediment, provide one of the best windows into ancient behavior. The Cambrian Explosion, as we have discussed, coincides with a dramatic increase in the diversity and complexity of trace fossils, indicating not just that more organisms were present, but that they were engaging in more varied and more complex behaviors. Simple grazing trails give way to systematic feeding patterns. Shallow surface traces give way to deep, complex burrow systems. The development of complex burrowing behavior in the Cambrian, the so-called agronomic revolution, had profound effects on the ecology of the seafloor. Before the Cambrian, the seafloor was overlain by a stable microbial mat that was rarely disturbed. With the advent of organisms capable of burrowing into the sediment, the mat was disrupted and ultimately largely destroyed in most shallow water environments. The sediment itself was mixed and aerated by the burrowing activity, a process called bioturbation, which changed the chemical environment of the seafloor and opened up entirely new ecological opportunities for organisms living in and on the sediment. Evidence for social behavior among Paleozoic marine animals is more speculative, but some clues exist. Certain trilobite fossils are found in groups that appear too structured to be entirely random, suggesting that these animals may have aggregated intentionally, perhaps for mating or for protection. The so-called trilobite trains, lines of trilobites found nose to tail, sometimes with dozens of individuals, have been interpreted as evidence of migratory or aggregating behavior, analogous to modern marine arthropods that gather in groups for specific biological purposes. The compound eyes of trilobites and other Cambrian arthropods suggest that visual signaling was possible, and if visual signals could be detected, they could potentially be used for communication as well as predator detection. Whether Cambrian arthropods actually communicated visually in any meaningful sense is impossible to determine from the fossil record alone, but the capacity was likely there. The oxygen story of the Paleozoic ocean is one of the most dramatic physical backdrops to the biological narrative we have been tracing. Oxygen levels, both in the atmosphere and in the ocean, were not stable through the Paleozoic. They fluctuated significantly, and those fluctuations had profound effects on marine life. In the Cambrian, atmospheric oxygen levels were probably significantly lower than today's approximately 21%. The ocean's oxygen content was correspondingly lower, particularly in deeper waters. This created a strong vertical gradient in oxygen availability that shaped the distribution of organisms through the water column. Many of the organisms that thrived in the Cambrian were small enough or metabolically slow enough to survive in low oxygen conditions. But the development of large, active animals with high metabolic rates requiring substantial oxygen delivery to active tissues, was constrained by the oxygen levels available. Through the Paleozoic, atmospheric oxygen rose overall, with significant fluctuations. The Carboniferous period saw an extraordinary spike in atmospheric oxygen. Levels may have reached as high as 35% of the atmosphere, driven by the burial of enormous quantities of organic carbon in the vast coal swamps that covered the land. This high oxygen level had dramatic effects on terrestrial life. It is thought to have enabled the evolution of giant insects, including the famous Meganeura, a dragonfly-like creature with a wingspan of over 60 centimeters, and giant millipedes like Arthropleura, which reached lengths of over 2 meters. In the ocean, the high oxygen levels may have fueled increased metabolic rates and supported larger, more active animals. Then through the Permian, oxygen levels began to decline again, a decline that would accelerate dramatically during the Great Dying itself, as the Siberian Traps eruptions consumed oxygen through the combustion of coal and organic-rich sediments, and as the warming ocean held less dissolved oxygen. The ocean at the peak of the Great Dying was, in many regions, essentially anoxic below the surface layer, a dead zone of stagnant, oxygen-free water that could support nothing but anaerobic bacteria. The recovery of ocean oxygen levels after the Great Dying was one of the key factors enabling the biological recovery. As volcanic activity waned and carbon was slowly absorbed by the recovering biosphere, oxygen levels in both the atmosphere and ocean gradually increased. The deep circulation of the ocean, which had been severely disrupted during the extinction, was re-established as temperature gradients and salinity differences between water masses were restored. Oxygenated water once again reached the deep ocean, and with it came the possibility of life in depths that had been anoxic for millions of years. The story of marine life in the Paleozoic cannot be fully appreciated without some consideration of the physical geography of the era, the positions of the continents, the configuration of the ocean basins, and how these changed over the 300-million-year span of the era. At the beginning of the Paleozoic in the Cambrian, the major landmasses were distributed differently from today. The supercontinent Gondwana, comprising what would eventually become Antarctica, Australia, South America, Africa, and parts of Asia, occupied much of the southern hemisphere. Laurentia, the core of what is now North America, and Baltica, the core of Europe, were separate landmasses, and much of their surfaces were covered by shallow epicontinental seas, broad, shallow arms of the ocean flooding the continental interiors. These shallow epicontinental seas were among the most productive and diverse marine environments of the early Paleozoic. Shallow water receives more sunlight, enabling higher rates of primary production. It is warmer, generally, than deep water. Nutrients from the continents are more readily available. The bottom is within reach of light, enabling photosynthetic benthic communities. And the physical diversity of a shallow water environment with its varying depths, substrates, currents, and exposures creates a mosaic of different microhabitats that supports far greater species diversity than a more uniform deep water environment. As the Paleozoic progressed, the configuration of the continents changed dramatically. Laurentia and Baltica began to converge during the Ordovician, eventually colliding during the Silurian in the event that built the ancient Caledonian mountain chain, whose eroded remnants can be seen today in Scandinavia, Scotland, and eastern North America. This collision closed the impetus ocean that had separated them and created new geological conditions on both the land and in the surrounding seas. The assembly of the supercontinent Pangaea, completed during the Permian, had particularly dramatic effects on the ocean. As all the major landmasses merged into a single giant continent, the global ocean shrank from a system of multiple ocean basins into essentially a single enormous ocean, Panthalassa, surrounding the supercontinent, with the Tethys Sea, a wide, warm embayment opening on Pangaea's eastern side. The reduction in the total length of continental shoreline that accompanied this merger reduced the area of shallow epicontinental seas, the most diverse and productive marine environments, to a fraction of what had existed earlier in the Paleozoic. This reduction in shallow marine habitat, driven by the assembly of Pangaea, is thought to have contributed to the general decline in marine diversity that occurred through parts of the Permian, even before the catastrophic End-Permian extinction. The carrying capacity of the ocean for marine species was reduced simply by the geometry of the continents, independent of any chemical or climatic changes. One of the most remarkable stories to emerge from the study of Paleozoic marine life is the story of the bryozoans, those tiny colonial animals that built intricate, branching, or encrusting structures across the seafloor. Bryozoans are easy to overlook in the grand narrative of Paleozoic marine evolution, overshadowed by the more charismatic trilobites and Anomalocaris and cephalopods. But they were, in terms of ecological importance, among the most significant organisms of the Paleozoic Sea. Bryozoan colonies were architects. They built complex three-dimensional structures, fans, branches, fenestrate lattices, that created physical habitat for other organisms. A large bryozoan colony provided surfaces for attachment, crevices for hiding, physical baffles that slowed water currents and created local depositional environments. In doing so, bryozoans were ecosystem engineers, organisms whose activities modified the physical environment in ways that created habitat for other species and increased the overall capacity of the ecosystem to support life. The fenestrate bryozoans of the Carboniferous and Permian were particularly elaborate. They grew as open, lattice-like fans, sometimes called lace corals, that filtered plankton from the water passing through their network of openings. These structures could grow to considerable sizes and formed significant components of Carboniferous reef-like communities. When the Great Dying eliminated the Paleozoic reef builders, it also eliminated most of the fenestrate and other elaborate bryozoan forms, leaving only a few lineages to carry the bryozoan legacy into the Triassic. The bryozoans that did survive the Great Dying, the cyclostome and later the chalostome bryozoans, went on to diversify in the Mesozoic and Cenozoic, and chalostome bryozoans in particular became extremely successful and diverse, eventually producing the dominant bryozoan fauna of the modern ocean. They are still with us, still building their tiny calcium carbonate structures on rocky surfaces and shells, and kelp fronds in every ocean of the world, still fulfilling the role of ecosystem engineers that their Paleozoic ancestors pioneered. The crinoids, those extraordinary animals that carpeted the Paleozoic seafloor with their meadows of swaying stalks and feathery arms, deserve their own moment of extended reflection, because their story is one of both spectacular success and near elimination, and their survival into the modern world is one of the more poignant threads of biological continuity across the Paleozoic boundary. In the Carboniferous period, crinoid abundance reached perhaps its greatest extent in the entire history of the group. Some shallow sea environments of the Carboniferous were almost entirely covered in crinoid meadows, their stalks rising from holdfast to arm tips in dense forests through which the water moved, carrying plankton to the waiting arms of millions upon millions of individuals. The death and accumulation of crinoid hard parts, their calcite plates and columnal segments, contributed enormously to the carbonate sediments of the period, building thick layers of crinoid limestone that today form prominent geological formations in many parts of the world. The Great Dying was devastating for the crinoids. Most lineages were wiped out. The vast diversity of Paleozoic crinoid forms, the stalked, the unstalked, the large, the tiny, the elaborate, and the simple, was reduced to a small number of surviving groups, and the meadows that had covered the Carboniferous seafloor were gone. But again, not entirely gone. The stalked crinoids survived, and their descendants still live today in the deep sea, where they still adopt the same basic posture as their Paleozoic ancestors. Anchored to the substrate, their arms spread into the current, filter feeding from the particles that drift past. Looking at a modern stalked crinoid, a delicate, elegant, feathery creature living in the cold dark of the deep ocean, you are looking at something that is, in its fundamental biology, essentially unchanged from the Carboniferous. The meadows of the shallow seas are gone, replaced by isolated individuals scattered across deep rocky surfaces. But the design endures, the biology endures, the connection to the Paleozoic endures. The feather stars, unstalked crinoids that can move across the seafloor and even swim short distances, diversified more dramatically in the Mesozoic and Cenozoic, and today they are abundant on coral reefs and in other shallow marine environments around the world. Watching a feather star spread its arms in a current on a tropical reef, you are watching an animal whose lineage extends back, through every catastrophe the earth has thrown at it, to the crinoid meadows of the Cambrian and Ordovician. It is a biological lineage more than 500 million years old, still here, still doing what it has always done. There is something deeply important about what the Paleozoic Sea teaches us regarding the relationship between diversity and resilience. The ocean at the peak of the Permian had reached extraordinary levels of diversity, thousands and thousands of species, hundreds of ecological roles, an intricate web of relationships woven over nearly 300 million years of evolution. And yet this diversity, this great edifice of biological complexity, proved fragile in the face of rapid, severe environmental change. The paradox is instructive. Ecological complexity provides resilience against moderate disturbances, against the loss of a few species here and there, against local changes in conditions, against the normal fluctuations that characterize any dynamic natural system. But ecological complexity can actually increase vulnerability to catastrophic disturbances, because complex systems have more intricate dependencies, more ways for cascading effects to propagate through the web of interactions. Losing a keystone species, one whose presence is critical to the functioning of many other aspects of the ecosystem, in a complex ecosystem can trigger a cascade of secondary extinctions that would not occur in a simpler system. The End-Permian extinction, triggered by environmental changes of truly catastrophic magnitude, overwhelmed the resilience of even the most complex and mature marine ecosystem that had ever existed on Earth. The lesson is not that complexity is bad, it is that even the most extraordinary biological system is ultimately dependent on the physical and chemical conditions that make it possible. Change those conditions fast enough and severely enough, and the most diverse and interconnected ecosystem on the planet can unravel in geological moments. This is a sobering lesson. And it is a lesson that has relevance not only to understanding the past, but to thinking carefully about the present and future of the ocean, though that is a story for another time and another context. What matters here is that the Paleozoic Sea experienced this lesson in the most extreme possible way, and that the surviving remnants of that great biological experiment carried its legacy forward into the world that followed. As the Triassic unfolded and the recovery from the Great Dying progressed, one of the most important developments was the re-establishment of productive plankton communities in the surface ocean. The base of the marine food web, the phytoplankton that captured sunlight and built the organic material that fed everything above them, had been severely disrupted during the extinction. The recovery of phytoplankton communities was essential for the recovery of everything else. Among the most significant developments in the Triassic Ocean was the emergence and diversification of two groups of phytoplankton that would go on to dominate the open ocean food web for the rest of Earth's history: the dinoflagellates and the coccolithophores. These groups, which produce some of the most important primary producers in the modern ocean, rose to prominence in the Triassic and Jurassic in the ecological space opened up by the End-Permian extinction. The coccolithophores, tiny algae that produce intricate, disc-shaped calcium carbonate plates called coccoliths, are particularly important in the context of the carbon cycle. Their production of carbonate plates and the subsequent sinking of those plates to the ocean floor when the organisms die is one of the major mechanisms by which carbon is sequestered from the surface ocean and atmosphere and transferred to long-term geological storage. The chalk formations of the Cretaceous period, including the white cliffs found across northern Europe, are composed largely of compacted coccoliths, a testament to the enormous productivity of these organisms at that time. The dinoflagellates, for their part, are important both as photosynthetic primary producers and as heterotrophs, capable of feeding on other particles when photosynthesis is insufficient. Their extraordinary metabolic flexibility makes them important members of marine communities across a wide range of conditions. The diversification of these new phytoplankton groups in the Triassic represents a fundamental shift in the nature of the ocean's productive base, a shift that was made possible by, and in turn enabled, the recovery and diversification of the animals above them in the food web. In this way, the transition from the Paleozoic to the Mesozoic ocean was not just a matter of which specific animals were present, but of how the entire system was organized from the bottom up. In reflecting on what the survivors of the Great Dying and the recovering ocean of the early Triassic tell us about the biology of persistence, several specific characteristics emerge as particularly important. Generalism, the ability to exploit a wide range of food sources and tolerate a wide range of environmental conditions, was a crucial survival advantage. Organisms that depended on a single prey type or a narrow range of conditions were at much higher risk of extinction when conditions changed dramatically. Organisms capable of switching dietary strategies, tolerating variable oxygen and temperature, or surviving in a range of habitat types had a much better chance of persisting through catastrophe. Small body size was also generally advantageous in the extinction context. Large-bodied animals require more food, have longer generation times, which slows evolutionary response to changing conditions, and often have smaller population sizes that are more vulnerable to demographic collapse. Small animals with high reproductive rates, producing many offspring quickly, can respond to changing conditions much faster through selection. Planktonic larval stages, as we have seen in the case of the ammonoids, provided a particular advantage in the recovery phase. Animals that produce large numbers of small, planktonic larvae can recolonize devastated environments rapidly as conditions improve, and can establish new populations from small founding populations. Deep sea or low oxygen tolerant lineages may have found refugia in the extreme environmental conditions of the extinction, environments so hostile that they were already under stress before the extinction, but that may have been buffered from some of the worst effects of the catastrophic changes. Organisms pre-adapted to low oxygen conditions may have been paradoxically better positioned to survive an extinction event that imposed low oxygen globally. And perhaps most important, geographic distribution was critical. Species with wide geographic ranges, present in many different ocean basins and at many different latitudes, had a much better chance of having at least some populations in conditions that were less severely affected than the global average. Geographic range is itself a form of resilience, providing a buffer against regional catastrophes and increasing the probability that at least some fraction of the species range experience conditions compatible with survival. These principles of survival under catastrophic conditions are not unique to the End-Permian extinction. They apply equally to the End-Ordovician, the End-Devonian, and other mass extinction events through the Paleozoic. They represent, in a sense, the evolutionary lessons that life learned from 400 million years of periodic catastrophe. The final chapter of the Paleozoic Sea, the recovery and its aftermath, brings us face to face with a profound question. What does it mean for the ocean to recover from a mass extinction? Is it simply a return to what existed before? Or is the post-extinction world fundamentally different in some way, shaped not just by what survived but by what was lost? The answer clearly is the latter. The Triassic Ocean was not a restoration of the Permian Ocean. It was a new creation, built from the pieces that remained, and shaped as much by what was absent as by what was present. The ecological roles that the extinct groups had occupied were not automatically filled by their survivors. Sometimes new lineages evolved to fill them, as the scleractinian corals filled the reef-building role vacated by the tabulate and rugose corals. Sometimes the roles remained partially or entirely vacant for millions of years, as was the case with apex predatory fish in the immediate aftermath of the placoderm extinction at the end of the Devonian. The organisms that thrived in the early recovery phase were often quite different in character from the dominant organisms of the mature Paleozoic ecosystem. They tended to be generalists, opportunists, animals that could exploit whatever resources were available. As the ecosystem matured and diversified, these early opportunists were gradually joined by, and sometimes replaced by, more specialized forms. The transition from an opportunist-dominated post-extinction ecosystem to a more complex, more specialized community is one of the recurrent patterns in the recovery from mass extinctions, visible not just in the aftermath of the Great Dying, but after every major extinction event through the Paleozoic. This pattern has a name in ecology: ecological succession. In a newly disturbed habitat, a freshly burned forest, a newly formed volcanic island, a seafloor scoured by a turbidity current, the first colonizers are generalists and opportunists, species capable of surviving in harsh, unstable conditions with few resources. Over time, these pioneer species modify the environment, creating organic matter, building physical structure, establishing the beginnings of a food web, in ways that make it possible for more demanding, more specialized species to establish themselves. And as the specialist species arrive, they further modify the environment and create conditions for additional species, in a cascade of ecological change that continues until the system reaches a more complex, more stable state. This same succession process, playing out over millions rather than years, is what drove the recovery of the ocean after the Great Dying. The first organisms to take hold in the devastated early Triassic Ocean were the opportunists, bacteria, simple invertebrates with broad tolerances, small, fast-reproducing fish. As these pioneers established themselves and began to build the rudiments of a food web, conditions improved for other, more demanding organisms. Slowly, generation by generation, the ocean grew more complex, more interconnected, more diverse. And from this slow process of ecological succession, the Mesozoic ocean emerged, different from the Paleozoic, built from different materials, organized around different groups, but connected, always connected, through the thin thread of biological continuity to everything the Paleozoic Sea had been. Looking back at the full arc of the Paleozoic Sea, from the quiet Precambrian microbial world through the explosion of the Cambrian, the diversifications of the Ordovician and Devonian, the riches of the Carboniferous, and the catastrophe and beginning of recovery that marked the end of the era. What endures most powerfully is not the detail, remarkable as the detail is. What endures is the sense of life as a process, not a static collection of species, but a dynamic, ever-changing system that responds to every challenge, finds every opportunity, and rebuilds itself from whatever remains after every catastrophe. The creatures of the Paleozoic Sea were not just biological curiosities. They were the pioneers and architects of everything that followed. The first animals to develop eyes changed the entire ecology of the ocean, triggering an arms race that drove the evolution of armor, speed, camouflage, and intelligence. The first animals to build reefs created habitats of such complexity and productivity that they supported an explosion of associated diversity. The first fish to develop jaws opened up dietary possibilities that ultimately led to the vertebrate conquest of the land and air. The first cephalopods to develop buoyant shells pioneered a form of locomotion that has persisted, in modified form, for 500 million years. Every innovation of the Paleozoic Sea echoes forward in time. Every solution found by evolution to the challenges of marine existence, how to move, how to feed, how to avoid predation, how to reproduce, how to survive the death of a world, is part of the living legacy that the Paleozoic bequeathed to everything that came after. The sharks that glide through modern oceans carry within their biology the accumulated evolutionary learning of more than 400 million years of existence in the sea. The nautiluses that drift through Pacific waters at depth are the last living relatives of the great cephalopod lineages that dominated the Paleozoic ocean. The crinoids on the deep seafloor trace their lineage to the meadows that covered the Carboniferous sea bottom in their millions. The horseshoe crabs that gather on sandy shores to spawn have been doing essentially the same thing for hundreds of millions of years in seas that have changed beyond recognition around them. These living connections to the Paleozoic are among the most extraordinary things in the natural world. They are not museum pieces, not relics preserved by accident. They are the living descendants of the creatures of the Paleozoic Sea, continuing the story that began in the Cambrian, adapting to the changed conditions of a changed world, carrying forward the biological inheritance of an era that most people have never heard of and that lasted 4 times longer than the age of the dinosaurs. The Paleozoic Sea was the great proving ground of complex life on Earth. For nearly 300 million years, it was the arena in which the fundamental strategies of animal existence were worked out and tested: predation and defense, filter feeding and active hunting, burrowing and swimming and crawling and floating, eyes and armor and speed and camouflage, cooperation in the form of colonial living, competition in the form of arms races between predator and prey. All of it worked out in the warm and cold and shallow and deep waters of an ancient ocean that no longer exists. What survives of the Paleozoic Sea is stone and the creatures that carry its legacy in their genes. The stone speaks through the language of fossils, imperfect, incomplete, but extraordinarily detailed when read carefully by those who have devoted their lives to the skill. The genes speak through the living descendants of the Paleozoic survivors, carrying in their molecular structures the deep memory of forms and functions worked out hundreds of millions of years ago. Both forms of testimony, the fossil record and the living biota, tell us that the Paleozoic Sea was one of the most extraordinary chapters in the history of life on this planet. That its creatures, however strange and however unlike anything alive today, were not primitive or simple but extraordinarily sophisticated, adapted with precision and elegance to the specific conditions of their world. That the ocean they inhabited was not a backdrop or a setting, but an active participant in their evolution, shaping them and being shaped by them in a dialogue that lasted for the entire span of the era. And both forms of testimony tell us that the end of the Paleozoic was not an ending in the deepest sense. It was a transformation, a reduction and a rebuilding, a passing of the baton from one set of living lineages to another, with the rules of the game intact even as the players changed. The ocean continued, life continued, the process continued. And in that continuation, in the persistence of life through every catastrophe, in the rebuilding of complexity from the ruins of what came before, in the extraordinary creativity of evolution given time enough and world enough to work with, lies the most important message of the Paleozoic Sea. Life is not fragile. It is not easily extinguished. It is, in the deepest possible sense, the most tenacious phenomenon this planet has ever produced. The ocean has been through the worst the earth could throw at it. It has been poisoned and boiled and frozen and acidified. It has been drained of oxygen and flooded with volcanic gases. It has been battered by impacts from space and convulsed by the movement of the very plates that hold it. And every time from whatever survived it has rebuilt, different, changed, but alive. The Paleozoic Sea is gone. Its creatures are dust and stone, but the ocean endures. And in the ocean, the legacy of the Paleozoic endures in every shark, in every nautilus, in every crinoid, in every brachiopod that still filters the water on some distant reef, in every ammonoid-descended snail that crawls across a tidal flat, in the deep structure of every marine food web on the planet. The bizarre creatures that ruled the Paleozoic Sea were not failures, they were the founders. They built the ocean's future with their lives and their deaths, with their evolutions and their extinctions, with their extraordinary, inexhaustible, endlessly creative biological experimentation across hundreds of millions of years of deep time. And what they built endures.